The glass of milk was still warm when Victoria Powell vanished from the Somerset neighborhood in New Brunswick, New Jersey, in the summer of 1954, population 9,012. That Sunday began with a clear sky and church bells echoing over the low rooftops. At 2:37 p.m., the Powells' neighbor, Ruth Keller, glanced out her kitchen window and saw the 3-year-old holding her wooden doll, walking along the freshly painted white fence while her mother, Marilyn, hung laundry in the backyard. Victoria stopped to pick up a fallen cloth, and across the street, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat stood watching, holding a small black handbag. Keller turned away for just a few seconds to switch off the stove, and when she looked back, the Powell porch was empty. Only the doll lay face up on the grass. A dark green Ford started at the end of the block and rolled slowly around the corner of Somerset Street. What happened in the next 10 minutes would haunt New Brunswick for more than half a century. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In the summer of 1954, New Brunswick, New Jersey still retained the distinctive post-war suburban calm, brightly painted wooden houses side by side, white picket fences surrounding green lawns, children playing on sidewalks without adult supervision, and life moving at a steady rhythm few believed could ever be disrupted. The Powell family lived in a small house on Somerset Street, where Edward Powell, a quiet, steady railroad worker, often spent his afternoons fixing an old radio, while Marilyn Powell tended the flower garden in the back, and 3-year-old Victoria was the center of all their joy. Victoria had light blonde, slightly curly hair, curious blue eyes, a shy but inquisitive nature, and she still clung to her mother around strangers. Her habit was to play near the fence, pick dandelions, and run back to show her parents. The family bond was natural and effortless. Marilyn always kept an eye on her from the kitchen window, and Edward unconsciously smiled every time he heard his daughter's little feet running. That afternoon seemed ordinary too, until a strange woman appeared for the first time on the quiet street, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of her face, walking slowly in a way that didn't feel like she belonged to the neighborhood. She paused for a moment in front of the Powell fence and looked at Victoria with an unreadable gaze, intense enough to make the neighbor's dog bark instinctively. Victoria looked up at the woman, then ran into the yard and whispered to Marilyn that some lady is looking at me, a small comment that gave Marilyn a fleeting unease. Still, after a few seconds of hesitation, she reassured herself that the neighborhood was safe, and the stranger was probably just visiting someone. Soon after, the woman disappeared down the road, leaving a vague, unsettling feeling that wasn't clear enough for anyone to act on. A little after 5 o'clock, as the sunlight began slanting across the porches, the woman returned, this time walking faster and focusing directly on where Victoria was playing. Edward had just gone inside to grab tools. Marilyn was busy checking something on the stove, just a few ordinary minutes of distraction, and at that exact moment, the woman approached the fence, bent down as if to speak to Victoria. No one heard what she said, but Victoria walked closer, and in a single instant, the woman scooped the child up, stepped around the fence, and carried her toward a dark green Ford parked just a few yards away. The car door opened and closed quickly, the engine started, and the vehicle rolled away from the quiet street before anyone realized something terrible had just happened. Minutes later, when Edward came back outside and didn't see his daughter, he called her name, first casually, then in rising panic. Marilyn rushed from the kitchen, scanned the yard, saw nothing, and ran across the grass screaming for her child. Their cries brought neighbors running. Everyone fanned out, some toward the park, others along the narrow path beside the woods. A boy in the neighborhood vaguely remembered a lady with a hat carrying Victoria away, but couldn't describe more. An older woman thought she'd seen a green car driving slowly earlier, but couldn't recall the license plate. Everything was hazy, unconfirmable. As time dragged on without hope, the Powells' panic became suffocating. They ran door to door, knocking desperately, but every trace dissolved into the silence of the afternoon. With no other choice, Edward went inside, hands shaking as he picked up the telephone, barely able to breathe as he dialed, his voice breaking when he told the operator that their 3-year-old daughter had just disappeared. On the other end of the line, the operator immediately recognized the emergency, coded the call, "Missing child, age 3, and transferred it straight to the New Brunswick Police Department. Within minutes, a patrol car was dispatched to Somerset Street, where the Powell family waited in agony on the front lawn. The first 2 officers stepped out and asked everyone to stay in place while they gathered initial statements. Edward was still trembling, Marilyn's shoulders slumped, and neighbors formed a tense circle around them. Police began taking the parents' accounts, the last moment they saw Victoria, exactly where she had been standing. Anyone who had passed by, every tiny detail. Edward could only remember stepping inside for about a minute to get tools. Marilyn had been at the stove checking dinner and had looked away from the window for just a short time. That gap was when Victoria vanished. Neighbors were questioned immediately afterward. A 10-year-old boy said he'd seen a woman in a wide-brimmed hat talking to Victoria, but wasn't sure he saw her face clearly. An older woman recalled a dark green Ford driving slowly through the area around that time, but couldn't remember the plate or driver. Police wrote everything down, trying to piece the fragments into a coherent timeline and separate verified facts from unconfirmed guesses. When they reconstructed the timeline, they pinpointed the critical window at 5 to 7 minutes, when both parents had briefly lost sight of Victoria. From the vague descriptions, police sketched a preliminary suspect profile: middle-aged woman, large hat, slim build, walking slowly, and the likely getaway vehicle, a dark green older model Ford. Though details were scarce, the fact that she was a stranger in the neighborhood stood out because nearly everyone on the street knew one another. The commanding officer quickly assessed the urgency. A 3-year-old carried off by an adult with access to a vehicle meant the child could be miles away in minutes. The first order was to seal off a 2-block radius and sweep every road connecting Somerset to side streets, but by the time units arrived, the suspect vehicle was long gone. Home security cameras didn't exist then. The nearest stores were blocks away and had no recording systems. Reconstructing the suspect's route depended almost entirely on the limited memories of witnesses who had seen something happen too fast and too suddenly. As officers tried to separate fact from scattered recollections, they also had to establish a realistic search perimeter, roads that allowed leaving the neighborhood unnoticed, slow-moving routes, intersections leading to main roads. Additional patrol units were sent in every direction, but no one had solid information on the green Ford, a common car at the time that couldn't be distinguished by a generic description. The situation grew harder as time passed without any reliable new witnesses. No one saw which way the car turned, and there was no clue where the strange woman had walked from or to. Police had to accept that in the moment the parents were distracted, the suspect had exploited a nearly perfect window to leave the scene without leaving clear traces. Patrol units reported back to headquarters that the danger level was high, and if they didn't find the direction of travel within the first hour, the search radius would have to expand dramatically, drastically reducing rescue effectiveness. Under the glow of police lights reflecting off the once peaceful neighborhood windows, the official investigation began with a harsh reality. No cameras, no license plate, no clear description, and only a few hazy memories of a woman no one knew. The dark green Ford had left Somerset Street without anyone determining its direction, leaving an information void that police had to fill before the only leads grew cold. Immediately after the initial report reached headquarters, the New Brunswick PD activated an expanded nighttime search plan, mobilizing police, fire department, and K-9 units to track any trace of Victoria before time erased whatever the suspect had left behind. Specialized vehicles flashed amber lights up and down the streets, illuminating darkened yards where worried residents clustered. Officers quickly set up a temporary staging area at the end of Somerset Street to divide search sectors and coordinate teams. The K-9 unit arrived first, 3 highly trained dogs specialized in missing child cases. One of Victoria's shirts was brought from the house for scent, and the dogs immediately led handlers toward a narrow road connecting the neighborhood to an open field near the edge of town. Officers with flashlights walked alongside, scanning for footprints or bent grass. As they neared a small wooded area on the eastern edge, the dogs kept changing direction, as if the scent trail was broken by wind or because Victoria had been picked up almost instantly. The woods weren't large but were dense and dark, forcing teams to sweep in a line, calling the child's name while looking for any dropped evidence. After nearly an hour, there was no clear discovery, no clothing, no small footprints, no sign anyone had passed through that afternoon. This reinforced the theory that the suspect never took Victoria into the woods and had only crossed the area to confuse the trail, or that the scent had simply been carried away by wind. From the woods, teams moved toward the Raritan River bank, where low bushes and local walking paths lined the water. Firefighters turned on floodlights to scan the muddy ground, hoping for footprints or tire tracks. However, the damp riverside and strong wind made traces hard to preserve. One group walked several hundred yards along the water, checking small docks and large rocks, but found nothing related to a 3-year-old. The river ran fast, and police knew that if the suspect had come this way, she had moved quickly and left nothing to follow. Leaving the river, teams proceeded to the city's old industrial area, abandoned warehouses, rusty storage yards, and quiet back roads. This was a plausible spot for anyone wanting to pause while staying hidden, especially in the first hours after an abduction. Patrol units split into 3 directions, searching each warehouse, checking wall gaps, side doors, any possible hiding places, while also looking for signs of a Ford oil drips, tire marks, even bits of rubber. Though officers found a few faint tire tracks in the dust, none were distinctive enough to link to the case. The age of the yard meant every mark blended with daily old activity, making identification nearly impossible. Meanwhile, along the main road leading out from Somerset, another team checked grassy shoulders and turnaround spots, but found nothing decisive. When every direction yielded nothing, the field commander briefly halted operations to reassess the data collected in the first 3 hours. They noted that the K9s had lost the scent almost immediately, consistent with Victoria being lifted and placed in a car within seconds. The absence of any small footprints or dropped items further supported the idea that the abduction was premeditated, not spontaneous. Officers also calculated the likely speed at which the dark green Ford could have left the area if it departed Somerset within 2-3 minutes. Another 5-7 minutes would put the suspect on a local highway, able to head in multiple directions across the state without being identified. The lack of surveillance cameras meant police couldn't trace the car's route, and neighborhood witnesses never saw the plate clearly, effectively stalling vehicle tracking on the first night. They also considered the possibility the suspect stopped somewhere nearby before traveling farther. But reports from search teams showed no evidence of that. As the clock neared midnight, the search radius had expanded miles beyond the neighborhood, with 0 results, putting heavy pressure on command. All signs pointed to the same grim conclusion: Victoria had most likely been taken far from Somerset very early on, along a route no one saw, and determining the suspect's direction that first night was extremely difficult. Although every unit continued searching the remaining planned zones, the reality was that the odds of catching the dark green Ford were dropping fast, and the night's efforts could now only focus on minimizing the distance the suspect had already put between herself and the reach of the New Brunswick police. When the first night's search produced no clear results, the New Brunswick police were forced to broaden the information net to the public, and only by the next morning, news of the 3-year-old's disappearance from Somerset Street had spread across central New Jersey faster than any overnight search effort. Local papers like the Home News Tribune and morning radio bulletins gave it top placement: 3-year-old missing in New Brunswick, believed taken into dark green Ford. Articles gave a basic description of Victoria Powell and urged anyone who saw a strange woman carrying a little girl who didn't appear to be hers anywhere in Middlesex County to call police immediately. A family photo ran with a short account of the circumstances, drawing extra public attention because a daytime child abduction in a quiet residential area was extremely rare. Thanks to the media ripple effect, residents in nearby neighborhoods began organizing volunteer search groups. Some who lived along the main roads to the highway walked both sides, checking empty lots and wooded strips. Others contacted police for the exact description of the green Ford and possible escape routes. Store owners along Livingston Avenue allowed police to review receipts, deliveries, or any unusual activity from the previous afternoon. Some residents even volunteered to redraw the entire area map to help patrol units identify turns the suspect might have taken to stay unnoticed. However, along with community concern, came a flood of inaccurate or unverifiable tips that forced police to sift through a chaotic volume of reports that very morning. Many callers claimed they had seen a woman with a big hat or a green car speeding somewhere overnight, but when investigated, most proved unrelated. Some mistook neighbors from the next town, others misremembered the time, and dark green Fords were so common they could be seen in almost any parking lot in the region. A woman in Edison reported seeing someone hurriedly put a child into a car at a gas station, but when police checked the station's only camera, which faced the cashier, no match was found, and evidence showed the woman was actually the child's aunt, unrelated to the kidnapping. Another report from Highland Park mentioned a green Ford parked in front of a convenience store for 5 minutes, but when police arrived, the owner confirmed it belonged to a late delivery driver with no suspicious activity. Calls like these poured in relentlessly, each requiring immediate verification and putting enormous strain on the coordination desk at the station. Meanwhile, several suspicious locations flagged by residents were thoroughly searched. An abandoned house at the end of Somerset, an old warehouse near the train tracks, and a temporary construction workers' camp on the city outskirts. Patrol units combed every room and back lot, but still found no item belonging to Victoria, and no sign a child had been there in the past 24 hours. The string of negative results forced police to confront the reality that while community tips were valuable, they also diluted the investigation when most came from fear, confusion, or an overeager desire to help. Police noted that every possible escape route remained open, and once the suspect left the neighborhood in the first few minutes, any Ford could easily blend into regular New Jersey traffic, especially since no checkpoints had been set up the previous night. In the increasingly charged community atmosphere, unease grew. If a child could be taken that easily, was the neighborhood really as safe as everyone believed? That very fear kept tips pouring in, even as their quality dropped hour by hour. Late that afternoon, police held a quick meeting with neighborhood representatives to update progress, explain steps already taken, and ask residents to report only information they were absolutely certain of to reduce noise. Despite the huge community effort, by the end of the day, every tip and suspicious location checked had produced nothing concrete, shifting the case from information chaos into a new, frustrating deadlock in the search for Victoria Powell. In the context of chaotic information from the community and the complete absence of any physical traces to follow, the police were forced to return to traditional investigative methods, narrowing down suspects who had potential access to children in the area, and individuals who had exhibited unusual behavior, even if it wasn't enough to draw conclusions, but still warranted close scrutiny. The first suspect mentioned was a middle-aged man named Arthur Meehan, who lived near a public playground 3 blocks from Somerset Street. He had drawn the attention of many parents in the neighborhood because he frequently appeared at the playground without any children accompanying him. Arthur often stood under the trees at the far end of the ball field, watching the children play with an expression that was hard to read, a behavior that had been causing unease among residents for months before the disappearance even occurred. When the police approached him, Arthur seemed surprised but cooperative. He insisted he simply enjoyed getting some fresh air and watching the kids play soccer because it made him happy. The police checked Arthur's schedule on the afternoon Victoria vanished and discovered he was working a part-time shift at an auto repair shop in South River during the critical time frame. The shop owner confirmed Arthur was there until after 6 p.m. to finish handing over a repaired vehicle, and the shop's time logs matched his statement. Despite his prior behavior raising suspicions, Arthur was eliminated from the suspect list when no evidence or indication whatsoever placed him on Somerset Street during the window of the abduction. The second suspect the police examined was a rather reclusive neighbor, Ellen Kirkwood, a widow in her mid-50s, who lived in an old house surrounded by an unusually tall iron fence. People in the neighborhood rarely interacted with her. Some rumors claimed she had a volatile temperament and disliked children, even having scolded kids in the past when their ball went into her yard. When the police knocked on her door, it took Ellen several minutes to answer, and she was visibly defensive. She stated that on the afternoon of the incident, she had been inside reading and heard no unusual noises from the street. The police searched the area around her house, including the backyard shed and the small garage used for storage, but found no signs of strangers or children having been there. Several neighbors reported not seeing Ellen leave her house all afternoon, and a newspaper delivery person confirmed encountering her at a time that overlapped with the abduction window. Although her surly attitude and the location of her house near an exit to the main road made her a potential suspect, the police found no inconsistencies in her statement and no evidence against her. After thorough checking, Ellen was cleared of suspicion. The next investigative direction focused on the green Ford, which was the only detail mentioned by multiple witnesses, even though the descriptions were very vague. In the 1950s, dark green Fords were extremely common and nearly impossible to distinguish without a license plate or distinctive features. The police combed through every registered vehicle in the area, starting with families living around Somerset Street and expanding to several blocks away. They located 3 green Fords that roughly matched the initial descriptions. One belonged to the Harris family, one to a local postal worker, and one to a young man living with his parents on the next street over. Upon inspecting each vehicle, the police found no signs that a child had been in the back seat, and no unusual stains, and all 3 owners had solid alibis. The first was attending a community meeting at 5 p.m., the second was working at the post office several miles away, and the third vehicle wasn't even used that day because it was in the shop for engine repairs. Beyond those 3, the police also checked other green Fords that residents reported seeing driving slowly that evening. But upon verification, every one belonged to local residents who never left the neighborhood during the critical time. This caused the vehicle-based line of inquiry to reach a near dead end, since other green Fords could easily have left the area before police were able to set up roadblocks. With all the primary nearby suspects eliminated, the police went back to reviewing lists of residents who had recently moved in or out within the past 3 months. But records from that era were incomplete, and checking each person took far longer than anticipated. The fact that no one in the neighborhood had a clear motive or lid made the case even more complicated. If the perpetrator wasn't someone familiar, it meant the woman in the wide-brimmed hat might not live in the area at all. She may have simply been passing through at exactly the wrong moment, making the chances of tracking her down even slimmer. Endless interviews, meticulous vehicle checks, and field trips to verify every tiny detail ultimately led the police to a grim interim conclusion. All the initial suspects, those with potential access to children or who regularly appeared in the area, had no direct connection to Victoria Powell's disappearance. Despite the force working around the clock, none of them remained under suspicion based on concrete evidence. That meant the internal neighborhood investigation no longer held promise, and the case was sliding toward an informational void that the police did not want to face just days after Victoria went missing. Immediately after all the initial neighborhood suspects were successively cleared, the New Brunswick police shifted focus to the group that always has to be checked in any missing child case, the victim's own family. This is standard procedure to rule out internal conflict, accidental tragedy caused by negligence, or any family-related disputes, even though there were no initial signs pointing to Victoria's parents being involved. Despite the chaos and the parents' emotional exhaustion, the police still had to conduct separate interviews to ensure objectivity. Edward Powell was brought to the station first, while a female officer stayed at the house with Marilyn to gather information in a calming manner. With Edward, detectives delved deeply into his work schedule over the previous days, checking for any financial pressure, marital discord, or family incidents that could have led to harm. Edward clearly outlined his shifts at the rail yard and provided documentation from his supervisor and co-workers confirming he clocked out on time and was home before the incident. There was no indication he left the area or met with strangers that afternoon. The police also reviewed the family's finances, but aside from a modest income sufficient for daily needs, there were no debts or disputes that could serve as a motive. With Marilyn, the verification process was equally thorough, aimed at clarifying her behavior, activities, and mental state in recent days. Neighbors confirmed she was a devoted mother who almost never raised her voice or showed violence toward Victoria. On the day of the disappearance, multiple witnesses saw Marilyn moving between the yard and the house, playing with her daughter several times before going inside to prepare dinner. When police timed how long her dinner preparations would realistically take, they were able to reconstruct a timeline that aligned closely with Edward's account. Both parents recounted the exact same sequence of events, with no discrepancies between their statements. The police further expanded the inquiry by checking both parents' mental health history. The family doctor confirmed that neither Edward nor Marilyn had ever sought treatment for mental health issues or prolonged stress. Aside from the ordinary fatigue of raising a young child, nothing abnormal was noted. Investigators also examined items inside the house for any signs of arguments, conflict, or external tampering. Nothing was out of place. There were no traces of violence, and the home fully matched the parents' story that Victoria had been playing in the yard when she vanished. Several witnesses confirmed seeing Victoria near the fence just minutes before she disappeared, consistent with her parents' account. Between interviews, the police re-examined the possibility of an accident within the yard, falling into a hidden spot, or getting trapped in a narrow space. However, searches had been exhaustive from the very first night and turned up nothing to support that theory. This only reinforced the conclusion that Victoria could not have left the yard without adult intervention from outside. At that point, the police dug deeper into the family's extended relationships, siblings, relatives, close friends, or anyone who might have had a grudge. Both Edward and Marilyn had lived in the area for years, were trusted by neighbors, and had no relatives with criminal records or reasons for family vendettas. A faint suspicion fell on a distant relative who had once faced financial trouble, but verification showed that person was out of state on the day of the incident. Even the family's communications the previous week, mail, phone calls, were all normal. Once every avenue from internal conflict to accidental harm, financial motives, or signs of domestic violence had been exhausted, the police reached a clear conclusion. Edward and Marilyn Powell were in no way involved in their daughter's disappearance. All evidence pointed to any criminal element coming from outside the family. After 2 straight days of work, the police officially cleared the Powell family as suspects, meaning they had to start over and continue facing the harsh reality. Victoria's abduction did not stem from internal conflict but from an unidentified external actor. While the family was drained by grief and worry, being removed from suspicion was both a relief and confirmation that the police now had to return to broader questions, as the suspect list continued to shrink without yielding any concrete leads. After the Powell family was officially cleared, investigators hoped narrowing the scope would open a new path, but the following days proved the opposite. No new discoveries or data emerged, causing the entire case to slide into a clear deadlock. Search teams kept sweeping areas already covered: small woods, the Raritan riverbank, abandoned industrial sites, and side roads, but every effort yielded the same result as before. Absolutely no trace of Victoria, no dropped belongings, no child-sized footprints, no indication the perpetrator had stopped anywhere within the established radius. With the likelihood of finding physical evidence gone, police expanded searches farther out toward roads leading away from the city and neighboring areas. However, Expanding the perimeter ran into another obstacle. New Brunswick's convenient location connected to multiple routes that could reach other regions in minutes. If the suspect fled immediately after the crime, they had countless ways to leave unnoticed. Patrol teams tried checking every major road from Somerset Street to the nearest highways, but aside from normal early summer traffic, there was no specific information to pinpoint the green Ford's direction. Witnesses, the only remaining hope for fresh leads, offered no progress. Residents were questioned repeatedly, but most insisted they saw nothing beyond their initial vague statements. Memories of the woman in the wide-brimmed hat or the green car were too fuzzy for serious analysis. Some witnesses even grew unsure when pressed again, fearing their recollection had sent police down the wrong path. Meanwhile, additional tips from surrounding areas added no valuable data. A few people reported seeing a strange woman at a park, but the timing didn't match. Others claimed to have seen a green car speeding on the highway, but descriptions were inconsistent and locations too distant from the scene. Every tip was verified, yet each led nowhere. In particular, the number of green Fords checked in the region kept growing, but the model's ubiquity made narrowing them down nearly hopeless. Each belonged to a different owner with airtight alibis. The repetition and tangle of information forced the team to confront the reality that the case had lacked key traceable elements from the start. No license plate, no clear suspect description, no travel traces, no physical evidence. Many officers began admitting privately that without a breakthrough, every avenue they pursued was just going in circles, hoping some overlooked detail would surface, but it never did. The command center held daily briefings, yet each ended with the same conclusion: no progress. Morale grew heavy, reflected in increasingly terse case notes showing there was simply nothing new to record. The absence of direction combined with public pressure made the investigation even harder. Media coverage dwindled as fresh information dried up, and public attention faded accordingly. Somerset Street residents remained anxious, but no longer knew what to do beyond waiting. Several volunteer groups disbanded, unable to keep searching in vain. Meanwhile, the Powell family remained crushed by alternating hope and despair, each passing day making the prospect of finding Victoria feel more distant. The police understood the case was at risk of slipping into prolonged stagnation, where even the intense early efforts couldn't produce the necessary breakthrough. In the days that followed, files thickened only with repeated reports of nothing new found, and gradually the case shifted from absolute emergency to a slower investigative pace, reflecting the reality that every lead had run dry. In this situation, the team could only wait for a sudden external tip or hope a witness's memory would unexpectedly sharpen, but both possibilities looked increasingly faint against the deepening deadlock surrounding Victoria Powell's disappearance. Nearly a year had passed since the day Victoria disappeared, and the prolonged deadlock in the investigation had left clear consequences for the Powell family and the peaceful life they once had. The house on Somerset Street, once filled with happy memories of Victoria's laughter, father-daughter afternoons playing in the yard, and mother-daughter moments tending the flower garden, had become a place heavy with pain, obsession, and mutual guilt. Because no one could forget the moment when just a few minutes of inattention had changed their lives forever. Whether they wanted it or not, every corner of the house reminded them of what they had lost. Victoria's little chair pulled up to the dining table, the toys left exactly as they were in her basket from the day she last played with them, and the everyday traces of her life that neither parent had the heart to put away. Those things made the atmosphere in the house so suffocating that they were forced to decide to move out of the neighborhood, partly to escape the attention of neighbors whose looks mixed pity with curiosity, and partly to try to get away from the guilt that still clung to each of them. They chose a smaller house in Highland Park, a quieter area, but changing locations could not erase any of the emotions that had been carved deep over the past year. Even after moving, Edward could not give up searching for his daughter. Whenever there was a rumor of a little girl spotted in a nearby town, or an unidentified child found on the road, or even a vague description that matched Victoria's age, he would immediately go to the location to check, This meant he spent most of the year driving all over New Jersey, then Pennsylvania, and even farther whenever someone said it might be her. It left him exhausted both mentally and physically, but Edward never stopped. Continuing the search had become part of his daily life, not because of any clear hope, but because he could not accept the feeling of giving up. Meanwhile, Marilyn tried to maintain a more normal life, but she too could not escape the impact of the constant waves of rumors about missing children everywhere that year. Every time the newspapers reported an unidentified little girl somewhere, from Connecticut to Delaware, her heart would tighten, even though she knew the chances of finding Victoria, after so many months, were practically zero. Among them, there were 3 cases that forced the New Brunswick police to contact them for verification: a little girl who appeared at a church in Trenton, a child abandoned in front of a convenience store in Newark, and a report of a lost child near the bus station in Camden. All 3 made the Powell family wait in agonizing suspense, but when the verification results came back, none of the children were Victoria. Each time, hope flared up for a moment and then faded, leaving a deeper emptiness than before. The repeated cycle of hope, disappointment, gradually caused Marilyn to withdraw, limiting contact with outsiders and staying silent when acquaintances asked how she was. She no longer wanted to hear empty words of comfort or questions that would never have answers. Even inside the house, the atmosphere was heavy and hollow. Meals became silent, and the couple rarely spoke about the future, as if everything had simply been put on pause the day Victoria vanished and could never return to the way it was. During this time, the police still kept in touch with the family whenever there was new information, but the frequency decreased as nothing emerged that was solid enough to reopen an investigative direction. Occasionally, there were still reports of a strange woman holding a child in some park, or a green Ford seen near another neighborhood, but every verification led to negative results. This made the Powell family feel increasingly left behind, as if their daughter's case was slowly being forgotten by the world. A year had passed, hope had not disappeared, but it no longer had the strength it did in the beginning. It had become something that smoldered, clinging to their lives in a way no one wanted. They still habitually looked out the window every afternoon, still startled at the sound of children's voices in the street, and still left Victoria's little bed in her room untouched, even though neither had the courage to go in there very often. In that silence, the Powell family understood that their lives had been clearly split into 2 parts before Victoria disappeared, and after every trace had faded without leading to any answers. From 1955 to 1960, the file on Victoria Powell's disappearance gradually slipped out of the orbit of priority cases and fell into a slow spiral of oblivion that many victims' families of that era were forced to face. After the urgent early months of investigation, followed by a year of deadlock and scattered hopes that led nowhere, the New Brunswick Police Department had to reallocate manpower to focus on newly emerging cases against the backdrop of the city's rapidly growing population and increasingly complex crime trends in surrounding areas. As the workload piled up, the original team that had investigated Victoria's case was gradually broken up to handle other duties, causing the file to receive less and less attention as the years passed. The officers who had been involved in the initial phase were also rotated to other departments such as patrol, traffic safety, or urban incident response, so the expertise and memory of the case were no longer concentrated as before. Record-keeping at the time had no digital systems or dedicated units like today. It relied mainly on notebooks, paper reports, and separate diagrams created by individual detectives. That meant Victoria's file, though initially classified as high priority, gradually became difficult to work with when new people took over and lacked a seamless overall picture of the case. By 1957, when the public had almost stopped mentioning the disappearance, the New Brunswick Police Department officially transferred the entire Victoria Powell file to the New Jersey Cold Case Unit, a small group tasked with archiving and handling cases no longer under active investigation. However, the Cold Case Unit of that era was not the dynamic investigative body it would later become. Instead, it functioned more like a classified storage facility where cases were ranked by importance, but only revisited if new information appeared or if another case indirectly related to it surfaced. Transferring the file to cold case meant that New Brunswick police no longer deployed search teams, no longer called additional witnesses, no longer checked reports of green Fords, and no longer analyzed the possibility of out-of-state suspects. The file was not abandoned, but it was also no longer subject to regular review. All of this created a prolonged silence in which Victoria's name remained on the folder cover, but each year only a few administrative notes were added rather than any real investigative data. The lead detective, who had spent the first weeks reconstructing every minute before the child vanished, also left the force by the end of the 1950s. He retired after more than 20 years of service, and although he carried memories of the Victoria case in his mind, he left little detailed guidance for whoever took over because the file already lacked the data needed to develop further. When he left, part of the memory of those early search days quietly vanished with him, since the younger detectives did not have enough information or experience to accurately picture the original context of the case. During these years, there were still occasional reports of lost children or unidentified children found in various parts of the state, but when cross-checked, none matched Victoria. Those notices were usually just recorded under unrelated and added to the ever-thickening file with no progress. The cold case unit of that period was mainly a storage operation, with neither the authority nor the resources to reinvestigate, so Victoria's file literally sat untouched. A stack of papers tied with cloth string, stored in drawer 7, third shelf in the basement of New Jersey Police Headquarters. For the Powell family, the silence from the investigative agency reflected a painful reality. Their daughter's case, once the focus of the entire city's attention, was no longer on the priority list. No more calls updating progress, no more witnesses, no more investigative leads. Though the family never stopped hoping, for the investigative system of the time, the case had officially entered the phase where the chances of finding answers had become more remote than ever. The years from 1955 to 1960 marked a quiet turning point in the case. From an urgent, hopeful search, it gradually shifted into the characteristic silence of a cold case file, lying dormant in storage, waiting for a signal, a new technology, or simply a coincidence strong enough to pull it back into the light. But while in New Jersey, the name Victoria Powell gradually faded from news reports and investigative records, in another place the story continued, quietly and unknown to anyone. That afternoon, after leaving the Somerset neighborhood, Helen Hargrove drove her green Ford through small towns along the way, crossed the Raritan Bridge, and headed straight southwest. She chose narrow, low-traffic roads, staying far from residential areas and large gas stations, as if she had planned the route in advance and knew exactly which places to avoid to remain undetected. The car moved silently through the deepening twilight and stopped only once in a sparse forest to check if anyone was following. By the time she reached the Pennsylvania border, the sky had gone dark, and a cool early summer wind slipped through the cracks in the windows. In the back seat, 3-year-old Victoria had fallen asleep in the arms of the strange woman who said nothing except soft, soothing whispers. Helen stopped at an old wooden house at the end of a dirt road on the outskirts of Lewisburg, a place she had lived a few years earlier before leaving to find a fresh start, as the few relatives she still had would later say. The house stood isolated, with no close neighbors except a farm half a mile away, a location quiet enough that no one would notice the addition of a 3-year-old child. There, Helen began the process of severing Victoria from her past by renaming her Caroline Hargrove, a name she chose entirely on her own and immediately started using in every interaction. Because Victoria was so young, changing her name turned out to be easier than Helen had expected. The child showed little strong reaction when the new woman kept calling her by a different name, and within just a few weeks, she began responding whenever she was called Caroline, as if it were the most natural thing. In the first months in Pennsylvania, Helen created an environment so closed off that Caroline was almost completely cut off from the outside world. No relatives visited, no friends came to the house, and there was no participation in any community activities. Helen worked part-time at a small store in town, but rarely brought Caroline with her. Instead, She left the child at home in a room with the curtains always drawn to avoid curious eyes. The local people only knew that Mrs. Hargrove, the woman who lived up on the hill, now had a child with her, but since Helen had always been reserved, no one asked deeper questions. For Caroline, that environment created a sense of safety, while simultaneously building an invisible wall that prevented her from forming any relationships other than with Helen. Every morning Helen prepared simple meals, and then had Caroline play by herself in the room with a few old wooden toys. Children that age usually need constant interaction, but Caroline quickly learned to entertain herself and observe the world through the small window that looked out onto the forest behind the house. Though Helen's care was not violent, she controlled Caroline almost absolutely, always watching every little activity, minimizing any time the child was out of sight, and especially keeping her away from anyone in town. When Caroline turned 4, Helen began teaching her the alphabet and numbers at home, explaining that school was not suitable for children who needed protection. Helen maintained a gentle but firm tone, and Caroline, who knew no other world, believed that was normal. Whenever Caroline asked about her real parents, Helen deftly sidestepped the question by saying it would only make you sad, or you'll understand when you're older. Those vague answers initially silenced Caroline, but as she grew, gaps in her memory began to appear like loose puzzle pieces. A garden with a white fence, a man who laughed loudly whenever he picked her up, a yellow dress she couldn't remember owning. However, Helen never allowed Caroline to pursue those memory fragments. Whenever the child asked, she changed the subject or pretended not to hear. Helen's controlling behavior did not stem from violence, but from a deep obsession with loss. Something Caroline, while still young, could not fully understand, but could sense in the way Helen always hugged her too tightly at bedtime, or reacted strongly whenever someone knocked at the door. Sometimes Caroline noticed the anxiety in Helen's eyes, especially when a stranger passed near the hill. She would immediately pull Caroline inside, shut the door and lock it, even if the person was only the mailman. That very control gradually shaped Caroline into a quiet child who observed more than she spoke, and who always believed the outside world held something dangerous she should not touch. When Caroline turned 5, Helen gave her an old doll, the only toy that resembled what ordinary children usually had. Caroline immediately loved it, but what surprised her was the inexplicable feeling of familiarity when she held it, as if she had once owned something similar. Helen noticed that attachment, but offered no further explanation, only reminding the child that everything here belongs to you, as long as you stay good and safe. As time passed, Caroline fully adapted to the new identity Helen had created for her. Though she didn't understand why her world was so small, she did not resist or ask too many questions. The stability Helen provided, even though it was suffocating and restrictive, allowed Caroline to grow within those boundaries without seeing the distortions hidden beneath. For a child taken from her birth family at such a young age, the fading memories and dependence on Helen meant that Caroline gradually came to see the woman as the only person truly connected to her. In the isolated wooden house in Pennsylvania, Caroline lived her early years under a completely new identity, never knowing that in the eyes of the outside world, her life had been severed from its true origins the moment Helen carried her out of New Jersey. When she turned 6, Caroline entered the age when most children begin to expand their world through preschool, peers, and activities outside the family, but that never happened for her. Helen never took Caroline to any educational facility, never enrolled her, and never allowed her to interact with the neighborhood children, even though there was a small preschool in Lewisburg right next to the local church. Whenever the neighbor from the nearby farm asked about her, or suggested that Caroline should attend classes with the other kids, Helen would only give an awkward smile and reply with the usual excuses: allergies, fragile health, or Caroline isn't ready to be around strangers yet. Because of that, Caroline's entire childhood revolved solely around the old wooden house on the hill. No playground, no friends, no long walks like the other children in town. Even when Helen took her down to the town to shop, Caroline was not allowed to get out of the car. Helen said crowded places were dangerous, that children could get lost or be taken by bad people, and her anxious tone made Caroline, who had nothing to compare it to, believe that the world out there was vast but full of risks. The only thing resembling a normal life was the lessons Helen taught herself: the alphabet, numbers, a few simple drawings, but everything took place inside the house, at the old wooden table, with the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, and the windows always covered by drawn curtains. Those conditions forced Caroline to learn early how to play and entertain herself alone, turning the limited space into her own private world, but they also left her completely lacking the social interaction a child needs to understand how the world works. Sometimes Caroline would catch sight of other children running past in the distance. Their laughter echoing up the hill stirred something strange in her, both attractive and distant. She didn't know what to call that feeling, only that it made her chest tighten, as if something familiar yet unreachable was just out of grasp. Helen could see that expression and would immediately pull her back inside, gently but firmly, never letting her linger at the door too long. As she grew older, Caroline began having sudden, hazy flashes of memory. While playing with her old doll, while lying in bed, listening to Helen read, or when she saw an object with a particular color or shape. Once, when Helen gave her a golden hair clip, Caroline suddenly felt it was incredibly familiar, as though someone else had fastened it in her hair long ago. Another time, the scent of soap on a bath towel brought back the sensation of someone's arms around her, a gentle warmth she could not connect to the woman standing in front of her. Most vivid of all was the recurring image of another woman, fleeting, soft, with a laugh very different from Helen's, an unclear figure that kept returning. Caroline couldn't explain these fragments. They came and went like dreams interrupted by a reality too different to reconcile. When Caroline was old enough to start asking questions, she asked Helen whether she had ever lived somewhere else or whether someone else had once taken care of her. Helen always reacted the same way: evasion, changing the subject, or vague answers, sometimes even making Caroline feel guilty, as if she were asking something she shouldn't. If Caroline asked a second time, Helen grew tense, her hands clutching the hem of her dress, eyes shifting as though hiding a deep fear. Sensing that unease, Caroline gradually stopped asking about the past, choosing silence over making Helen anxious. Living in a completely controlled environment, Caroline developed into a quiet child, highly sensitive to others' emotions, and always trying not to upset anyone, especially Helen. Ordinary children tend to rebel when overly restricted, but Caroline did not. She didn't see the restrictions as prohibitions, but as the natural rules of life, as far back as she could remember. Helen said outsiders were dangerous, school wasn't safe, keeping secrets was for their own good, and Caroline believed her. In that house almost cut off from the world, every year was the same. Waking to the sound of forest birds, learning a few letters, playing alone in her room, helping Helen clean, then going to bed while it was still light in winter. But as she grew older, Caroline became increasingly aware of how different she was from the other children, not just because she didn't go to school, but from the curious stares of townspeople whenever the two of them appeared in town. They looked at Caroline as if she were a stranger who didn't belong, and although they never asked directly, she could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air whenever Helen gripped her hand and hurried away faster than usual. Helen continued to dodge every question about Caroline's origins, and even eliminated any chance the girl might receive information from outside. No newspapers, no radio, no comic books, only a few old children's books Helen approved of. When Caroline asked why she had no baby pictures like the other town kids, who sometimes showed each other theirs, Helen simply said, "Mom couldn't keep them because we moved so many times," an answer that sounded reasonable to a child, but became less convincing as Caroline grew older. Yet because Helen was the only person Caroline had to rely on, she learned to believe those explanations, or at least accept them as part of a reality she couldn't change. From age 7 to around 8, Caroline lived inside Helen's protective circle without realizing that those hazy memories were the roots that had been severed from her life very early on. In that closed-off world, she kept growing, carrying questions she couldn't put into words, and fleeting images of a different life she didn't know belonged to someone else, or to herself. When Caroline reached 17, then 18, the sealed world Helen had built around her since childhood began colliding with the realities of adult life, and seemingly simple administrative requirements, like applying for a part-time job or getting a social security number, became the starting point for a chain of contradictions that made Caroline doubt for the first time that she was the person she had always believed herself to be. In Lewisburg, most teenagers looked for part-time work at the grocery store, the auto shop, the dry goods store, or the local library. Caroline wanted to try too, to earn a little money of her own and experience something beyond the little wooden house she shared with her mother. But from the very first application, she hit a problem. The stores required a social security number, birth certificate, or at least some valid ID. Caroline went home and asked Helen, thinking it would be simple, but Helen's immediate reaction left her confused. Helen quickly said the documents had been lost during the last move, that getting replacements was too much trouble, and that Caroline didn't need to work. "Our life now is stable enough." The words sounded reassuring, but Helen's tense face and the way her hands gripped the edge of the table were nothing like her usual calm explanations. Caroline asked for more details, her exact birthday, place of birth, the hospital where Helen had given birth. But Helen gave evasive or off-topic answers, sometimes repeating the same things she'd said when Caroline was little. That they had moved many times, that the past didn't matter, that Caroline should focus on the present. When she applied at the library, the person accepting applications asked the same questions and whether she had an SSN. Caroline went home and asked Helen again, and this time Helen became so flustered she almost lost control, practically begging Caroline not to look for work, saying they'll misunderstand everything, that paperwork is nothing but trouble, and that the two of them should avoid such procedures because they only cause problems, not solutions. Caroline had always trusted Helen before, but as an adult she was perceptive enough to sense that Helen's avoidance was no longer protection, it was fear of something being discovered. From then on, Caroline started noticing details she had once thought normal. Helen avoiding crowded places, growing anxious whenever strangers looked at Caroline too long, never letting her go anywhere alone for more than a few minutes, and always keeping both of their personal documents locked in a box Caroline was never allowed to touch. She realized she had never seen a birth certificate, vaccination records, or any document proving she had ever been officially registered, things all her peers had when they got driver's licenses or registered for school. That absence made Caroline feel as though her identity existed only in words, with no real foundation. She began quietly asking older townspeople what they remembered about her when she was little, but most said they only knew that Caroline had appeared with Helen one day, from who knows where. Some even recalled that Helen had lived alone for a long time before Caroline arrived, raising a huge question: if Caroline really was Helen's biological daughter, why had no one in town ever heard about Helen being pregnant or giving birth? That question haunted Caroline for weeks. Refusing to accept the vagueness any longer, Caroline went to the local administrative office to ask how to obtain a replacement birth certificate. The clerk searched, but found no record of any Caroline Hargrove in the county birth records, nor any trace of her in school or medical systems in the area. The clerk asked whether she might have been born in another state or under a different legal name, but Caroline had no answer. She came home with a note, but a heart full of confusion. When Helen learned Caroline had gone to the administrative office, she reacted more strongly than ever before, panicked, terrified, and for a rare moment angry. She told Caroline she didn't understand, that government offices can't be trusted, that their information was inaccurate. But her trembling voice only convinced Caroline further that Helen was hiding something important. From that moment, the identity conflict became an obsession for Caroline. She wondered why she had no documents, Why Helen couldn't remember her birthday consistently, sometimes saying fall, sometimes winter, with the day and even the year changing, depending on when Caroline asked. The older she got, the more she realized her vague childhood memories didn't match the stories Helen told. She remembered a white fence, a garden full of flowers, a gentle man's voice that definitely wasn't Helen's. Those memories weren't frequent or clear, but whenever they surfaced, they felt like trying to recall a book with the first half torn out. Helen noticed the change in Caroline's attitude and kept dodging questions about the past, using excuses like it's too painful or I don't want you to get hurt. But the vagueness only deepened Caroline's suspicion. For the first time in her life, she felt that her identity was not something obvious that everyone simply has. It was something she had to search for, confront, and she wasn't sure she was ready to learn where the truth lay. While Caroline began doubting herself and searching for answers about her true identity, back in New Jersey, where her life had once been torn from its original path, the missing person file of Victoria Powell remained untouched in the cold case storage room for decades, like a dusty folder tied with cloth ribbon and moved from shelf to shelf whenever the archives were reorganized. In the large but dimly lit basement room of an old government building, hundreds of unsolved cases were kept in long rows of metal cabinets, and the Powell file was just one of countless folders that had once drawn attention before slowly fading into oblivion when no new leads appeared. The file contained a few initial reports, witness statements, a scene diagram, and some notes from the original detective before he retired. Over time, later additions were only brief lines, no new developments, no additional witnesses, no connection to other cases. Each year, when a new young officer in the cold case unit was assigned to review old files as training, they might flip through the Powell file, read a few pages, check it off the list, and put it back, not because they didn't care, but because the file offered nothing to pursue further. No crime scene photos, no physical evidence, no clear suspect description, no license plate, no identifiable witnesses, no medical reports or legal data. Everything made the Powell case an empty shell, where every possible investigative avenue had ended in the first year. Young officers sometimes asked older colleagues why the case had once been considered important, only to receive vague answers like, "It shook the whole neighborhood back then," or "We never found anything, so it just stayed cold." And over time, even those who had heard the story retired or left the force, leaving the Powell file alone among newer cases. The manual storage methods of that earlier era made the file even harder to access. Papers yellowed and faded, maps stained, some pencil notes so faint they could barely be read. Younger reviewers quickly saw that the case lacked everything modern investigations rely on: no fingerprints, no DNA, no witness photos, no traffic data, and no recording of the original family call, something that simply didn't exist in that era. As a result, no one had grounds to reopen questions or bring the case back to an active desk. Over the years, the case slipped further into the background of cold case storage, like a puzzle piece that no longer fit any picture in the statewide crime landscape. Occasionally, when a report came in of a missing or unidentified child found elsewhere, an officer on duty might pull the file to compare, but within minutes, they would close it again. Ages didn't match, birth years were wrong, or the circumstances of the found child had no relation to the 1954 disappearance. The Powell file, with its scant details and faint leads, never connected to any report over decades. That very lack of connection rendered the file dead for investigative purposes. It existed physically in storage, but no longer had the life of a case still seeking answers. There was also no family member regularly updating information or staying in contact. Not because they had forgotten, but because they had exhausted themselves after years of waiting, and knew further contact would change nothing. The family's silence mirrored the agency's silence, and together those two silences pushed the Powell file deeper into the seventh drawer of the cabinet. By the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, as New Jersey went through major administrative reorganizations, many old cold case files, including Powell's, were moved 3 times. Each relocation simply placed the folder in a new spot, checked as inactive, and returned to silence among hundreds of others. Over the years, no one mentioned Victoria Powell's name outside of old newspaper clippings kept in the town library. The case that once had the community terrified and police working around the clock became nothing more than a name gradually fading under thick dust in cold case storage, a name that meant nothing to young detectives and lacked enough data ever to be placed back on a desk. For 5 decades, the Powell file existed as a silent testament to a moment when every effort was halted by the perfect, absolute disappearance of a child, until the investigative system, finding no remaining threads to follow, had no choice but to let go and allow the case to fall into complete oblivion. After years of living under a cloud of doubt about her own identity, Caroline entered a phase where every question that had long smoldered beneath the surface began to surface more clearly, coinciding with an unavoidable event. Helen Hargrove's death, following a mild but mysterious stroke, leaving Caroline alone in the wooden house that had long been all too familiar with suffocating silence. Helen had few relatives, no close friends, and certainly no one who had stayed long enough to understand her life. As a result, the entire burden of settling the estate, clearing the house, and handling the paperwork fell on Caroline. The only child the world had ever seen Helen have. In the first days of cleaning, Caroline felt only a strange emptiness. The house, already quiet, had become even more silent, as though the sole source of energy that had ever tied it to life had vanished completely. She packed Helen's clothes into boxes, opened drawers, pulled out long unused containers, and sorted through objects the two of them had kept for years. Everything proceeded like a mechanical process that simply had to be completed, until Caroline opened the wooden cabinet built into the wall, the one Helen had always kept locked, and only opened when she needed personal documents. The key was on the ring Caroline had found in a desk drawer, and when the lock clicked open, Caroline felt as though she were opening a door to the part of Helen's life she had always tried to hide. Inside the cabinet there was far less than Caroline had imagined. A few stacks of old papers, a neatly folded woolen shawl, a sealed metal box, and a small old wooden box covered in dust but still sturdy. Caroline's attention went immediately to the wooden box, not because it stood out, but because instinct told her this object did not belong to the Hargrove family the way she had always been told. She lifted the wooden box out of the cabinet, set it on the table, and studied the darkened grain of the wood worn by time. The lid was held by 2 small hinges at the back. There was no lock, only a gentle push required to open it. Yet Caroline hesitated for a long while, as if opening that box meant stepping into a territory of memory she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Still, the loss of Helen, the only person Caroline had ever considered family, had created a void too large, and the hope of finding answers among what she had left behind finally made Caroline lift the lid. Inside, on top, lay a child's cotton dress from the 1950s, the color faded, but the small floral pattern still clear. Caroline had no memory of ever wearing it, yet the moment she touched it, an indescribable familiarity washed over her, as if her body remembered something her mind could not recall. Beneath the dress was a small silver bracelet engraved with the initials VP letters that stopped Caroline cold for several seconds. She repeated them silently, trying to connect them to any story or name Helen had ever mentioned, but nothing matched. Helen had never used those initials in any tale, never spoken of anyone whose name began with V or P. The next item in the box was a small stack of photographs tied with a thin ribbon. Caroline untied it, spread the pictures out, and saw 3 people, 2 women standing close together, and a little girl of about 3 with lightly curly hair, smiling brightly. One of the women was unmistakably a younger Helen, but the other Caroline had never seen, a gentle face, bright eyes, a kind demeanor that felt strangely familiar in a way Caroline couldn't explain. And the little girl, Caroline had to sit down, her heart racing, because the child's features were the same ones she saw in the mirror every day, only much younger. The girl could only be herself, Yet what took Caroline's breath away was the body language of the two women. Helen rested a hand on the child's shoulder, but the other woman held the little girl as though she were her own flesh and blood. Caroline turned the photos over, but there were no captions, no dates, no notes written on the back. Every image contained only those three people, seemingly intimate, seemingly close. Yet there was no explanation from Helen to pass on to Caroline. As she set the photos down on the table, a dark wave of thoughts crashed over her. Why had Helen kept these pictures? Who was the second woman? And most importantly, why did the bracelet bear initials Caroline had never once heard? Fragments from a past that had always been hazy and appeared only in fleeting dreams suddenly became tangible. Caroline remembered vague memories of another woman, a gentle face that had appeared like a shadow in her earliest childhood recollections. Everything was beginning to line up in a way that sent chills down her spine. She looked at the photos again and realized what disturbed her most. Helen's eyes in the pictures did not look like the eyes of a mother photographing her child. They were tense, guarded, completely unlike the natural, overflowing love in the other woman's expression toward the little girl. The more Caroline looked, the more it seemed the two women did not share the same relationship with the child at all. One gazed at the girl with pure tenderness. The other looked as though she were afraid of losing something. When she touched the bracelet again, that familiar feeling returned. VP, those two letters echoed like a sound from a part of memory never allowed to surface. Caroline sat motionless in front of the open box, understanding that what she was looking at was not merely a few old keepsakes, but possibly evidence that her entire life had not begun in Pennsylvania, had never been tied to the Hargrove family, and was not the story Helen had told her. For the first time, Caroline's doubt was no longer vague. It had shape, form, and proof lying right in front of her. And the fact that Helen had kept these items for decades, hidden in a locked cabinet, only convinced Caroline further that she had been concealing something far greater. Something that could change everything Caroline thought she knew about herself. After discovering the wooden box with its inexplicable contents, Caroline entered a phase where suspicion was no longer a passing feeling, but an urgent need to find answers in the very gaps Helen had left behind. She began investigating her true identity by approaching the places that store basic citizen records, hoping to find clues to the question, who was Caroline Hargrove really, and did she even exist on paper? Her first stop was the largest hospital in the Lewisburg area, the place she believed Helen might have given birth to her or received treatment when she was small. Caroline explained that she wanted a copy of her birth record, but when staff searched the birth year she provided, they found nothing. The supervisor suggested checking nearby years in case the date had been recorded incorrectly. They searched 3 full years, yet there was no Caroline Hargrove, no birth record that matched her description. When asked about other hospitals, Caroline had to admit she didn't know the name of the hospital or even the town where she was supposedly born, a response that left the records clerk visibly puzzled. Caroline left the hospital feeling both hollow and uneasy, as if she had expected the result, yet still hoped for a miracle. Undeterred, she went next to the county courthouse to check adoption records, the logical next step for someone with no valid birth certificate. The clerk searched under the Hargrove name, under the first name Caroline, and through all adoptions processed in the years corresponding to Caroline's birth. Once again, there was no record of Helen ever adopting a child, no data that matched Caroline. The clerk explained that nearly all adoptions leave some trace in the system, even if the files are sealed for privacy. The legal guardian's name must still appear. A complete absence of data was highly unusual. Caroline left the courthouse with a thick fog settling over her mind. She began to realize that the stories Helen had repeated for years. We moved so often, the papers got lost. It's too complicated to replace them, were nothing more than a string of excuses designed to silence her questions rather than clarify her origins. When both official avenues led nowhere, Caroline turned to less formal sources. People who had lived near Helen during her early years in Lewisburg. She visited the nearby farm where Mr. and Mrs. Fincher, the elderly couple who had been Helen's first neighbors, still lived. They recalled that when Helen moved into the wooden house, she lived entirely alone, never mentioning family or relatives, and certainly never speaking of pregnancy or giving birth. According to them, Caroline's sudden appearance the following year came as a shock because no one had known Helen was pregnant, and there had been no visible signs of a woman who had recently given birth. One day, they said, Helen simply had a child with her, offering no clear explanation, only saying it was a cousin's child she was caring for temporarily. When pressed, Helen would deflect by saying family circumstances were complicated and she didn't want to talk about sad things. When Caroline asked about any odd behavior at the time, Mrs. Fincher remembered that Helen was extremely guarded, often covering the windows, never letting Caroline play in the yard, and immediately closing the door and drawing the curtains whenever strangers came up the hill, as if hiding something. Mr. Fincher added that several times he had seen Helen leave the house early in the morning, carrying Caroline to the car and return hours later, without anyone knowing where they had gone. The most striking detail was that twice, townspeople had seen Helen arguing with an unknown woman near the local market. No one knew what the argument was about, but the woman appeared very upset while Helen tried to disappear from her sight as quickly as possible. That made Caroline shiver, recalling the unknown woman in the photographs from the wooden box. She couldn't be certain, but she felt that the secrets Helen had continually shut away and evaded throughout Caroline's childhood all stemmed from that period. The more she listened, the clearer it became that her life had been built on layers of secrets Helen had buried for decades. No birth record, no adoption papers, no verifiable proof that she was Helen's biological child, only vague memories and objects that didn't fit any story Helen had ever told. It all made Caroline realize that the truth about who she was did not lie in that wooden house, but somewhere else, in a severed piece of the past that Helen had clutched like a secret she never intended to reveal. After months of chasing scattered clues and unfillable gaps in the records of her life, Caroline entered 2011 with an increasingly heavy heart. Every answer she found only led to a harder question, while every place that should have held proof of her existence remained completely blank. In that state, her health began showing signs of trouble. Constant fatigue, headaches, and dizziness forced her to go to the hospital for a full checkup. There, the doctor suspected hereditary metabolic issue and ordered an in-depth DNA test to assess risks related to genetic conditions. Caroline never imagined the test could connect to her doubts about her identity. She agreed purely for medical reasons, believing it would help the doctor create an appropriate treatment plan. The DNA sample was taken quickly, and the hospital informed her that the results would be processed through an expanded genetic testing system that automatically cross-references data with medical research databases and genealogical DNA repositories used to establish blood relationships for family tracing or ancestry purposes. Caroline paid little attention to the genealogical part and hardly expected it to return anything, since she believed she had no relatives registered in such systems. Yet only a few weeks later, the hospital contacted her again in an unusually serious tone, asking her to meet with a genetic counselor to discuss the results in person. Caroline felt uneasy, but went to the appointment, assuming her health problem might be grave. Sitting at the counseling table, she heard the counselor explain that the medical portion of her test showed nothing worrisome, but the genealogical DNA results revealed something extraordinary. Caroline's DNA shared a significant partial match with a cluster of data belonging to the Powell family, a family from New Jersey that had participated in a multi-generational genetic research archive. The counselor, unaware of Caroline's personal search or secrets, stated neutrally that the system had linked her DNA to this family group at an unusually high confidence level, strongly suggesting a close blood relationship. Caroline froze, feeling the blood rush to her head and then drain away in an instant. Powell, a name she had never heard in her life, yet it matched eerily with the VP engraved on the bracelet she had found in the wooden box. The coincidence made her hands tremble as she tried to stay calm and asked whether the system could be wrong. The counselor shook her head. Genealogical DNA can be mistaken at low match percentages, but when it indicates a close relationship, the error rate is virtually zero. Not fully understanding the implications, but sensing a direct connection to the secrets of her past, Caroline requested a summary report. The counselor provided a short analysis showing that her DNA shared numerous markers with members of the Powell lineage, not distant cousins, but at a level consistent with direct descendants or very close relatives. Caroline left the hospital clutching the report in a daze. The name Powell echoed in her mind, like something Helen had gone to any length to bury. She returned home, reopened the wooden box, stared at the VP bracelet, and the photos where the little girl was unmistakably her. She still didn't know who the second woman in the pictures was, but her first thought now was that woman might be connected to the Powells. And if so, it meant Helen had lied about where she came from. But the biggest shock was still to come. 2 days later, an email arrived in Caroline's inbox. The genealogical DNA system, linked to legal databases across multiple states, had automatically forwarded an alert to law enforcement in New Jersey upon detecting that her sample matched data collected in certain unsolved case files. The message gave no specific details, but one sentence made her heart nearly stop. The matching data is associated with an unresolved case dating to 1954. Caroline had no idea what the case was or how it could involve her, but the year 1954, a date far removed from anything Helen had ever mentioned, felt like touching a memory that didn't belong to her present life. At the same time, in New Jersey, the DNA match report sent through official channels reached FBI Newark, the unit responsible for handling alerts tied to old records. It was just one signal among thousands the system generated each year, but because it involved a 1954 case and the Powell family, it was automatically flagged for review. Caroline had no idea that from the moment that alert was sent, her DNA, the genetic signature of a quiet woman living in Pennsylvania, had brushed against a case file that had lain dormant for nearly 6 decades in the New Jersey cold case archives. At that moment, all Caroline knew was that every piece of data she had just uncovered stood in complete opposition to the story Helen had constructed. And those DNA results were not just numbers. They might be the first real key to a truth she had never been allowed to know in her entire life. At the FBI Newark office, a DNA match alert linked to an unsolved 1954 case popped up on the system one April morning, just one of hundreds of hits agents have to sift through every week. But the brief description, match with Powell Group New Jersey 1954, made Special Agent David Carter, who handles cold case alerts, pause longer than usual. Carter had years of experience reviewing backlogged files and knew that missing child cases from the previous century almost never produced new results unless there was a mistake or an unusual data update. He pulled the original digitized file, which contained only very limited information about Victoria Powell, then asked the internal archives to bring up the old paper file from storage. When the folder was placed on his desk, the cloth tie around it showed it hadn't been opened in years. Carter flipped through the pages, the initial report, the parent's statements, a few notes from the 1954 lead detective, and scattered updates over the following years, all faded, lacking data, and showing an investigation that had gone cold long ago. At that moment, Special Agent Lauren Briggs, Carter's colleague, who had worked many child abduction cases, walked into the room. Seeing the open file, she asked if it was another false alert. Carter handed her the printed DNA result, and within seconds, she understood why he'd held on to it. The match wasn't in the margin of error range. It fell into the close blood relative category. That made it impossible to dismiss. Briggs suggested they immediately verify the source of the DNA submission to rule out any hospital data entry error. They contacted the genealogical DNA system and received confirmation that the submitted sample came from a legitimate medical test. The tested individual's identity had not been falsified, and the data had been processed through the proper 3-step verification protocol. Their verification could only point in one direction. The person named Caroline Hargrove, whose DNA sample originated in Pennsylvania, was a direct or very close blood relative of the Powell family, who had reported their daughter missing in 1954. Briggs immediately pulled every remaining record on the Powell family she could find, including old addresses, contact files, and New Brunswick police notes. One detail that caught both agents' attention was the age at disappearance. Victoria Powell vanished at age 3. The newly submitted DNA sample belonged to someone who would have been roughly that same age if you counted backward. It still wasn't conclusive, but Carter and Briggs both knew that a high-level DNA match combined with matching age and the Powell surname could not be ignored. Carter asked the Internal Analysis Unit to rebuild the entire missing person file to modern standards, redigitize the old data, retranscribe the statements, convert faded notes into clear text, and reconstruct the timeline using current software. The goal was to see if anything in the past might now connect to the new DNA information. In a few hours of non-stop work, they produced a new, cleaner, clearer, and easier-to-compare file, but it also revealed a huge gap. The entire 1954 investigation had no physical evidence whatsoever. The only thing of value now was the DNA result. Briggs kept digging into Caroline's records to learn where she lived, how her birth year was documented, and whether any administrative records lined up with the time she first appeared with Helen Hargrove. The deeper she went, the more she discovered that Caroline had no official birth certificate, no adoption records, no school files, something extremely unusual for someone who had lived in the United States for decades. That shifted the investigation from verifying a system alert to establishing an identity that may have been concealed for nearly 6 decades. Briggs and Carter discussed it and agreed this DNA result could not be brushed off like the false alerts. They needed to contact the woman named Caroline Hargrove to determine 2 things: 1, why her DNA matched the Powell family, and 2, whether she could be the person tied to the 1954 missing child case. To do that, they had to prepare carefully, pull every piece of data related to Caroline, confirm her current address, locate information on Helen Hargrove, the only recorded guardian, and check for any legal connection between the two. When they ran Helen's name, Briggs found one striking detail: there was no hospital birth record for her having a child in Pennsylvania during the period when Caroline was supposedly born. That only heightened the urgency. Carter drafted a report to his superiors requesting approval for direct contact with Caroline. They had to be careful. If this woman was truly connected to the 1954 disappearance, the contact had to follow full legal protocol while protecting her safety and emotional well-being. As he finished the report, Carter glanced at the dusty, thick file and told Briggs this might be the first time in decades that the Victoria Powell case had a chance to be seen in a clearer light. Briggs nodded, knowing the next step would decide the entire direction of the investigation. They had to reach out to Caroline Hargrove, the woman who had just appeared in the system after nearly 60 years, with a DNA result that could not be ignored. Once FBI Newark was officially authorized to contact Caroline, agents Carter and Briggs immediately drove to Pennsylvania to conduct the initial contact, a task they knew required absolute care, because they were approaching an adult woman who might carry fragmented memories from nearly 60 years earlier that she herself had never fully understood. They had no idea how Caroline would react or what really awaited behind the door of the wooden house where she had lived since childhood. When the 2 agents knocked, Caroline opened the door with the familiar wariness that had been drilled into her after years of living under Helen's control and vigilance. Briggs introduced them as FBI Newark and said they needed to speak about a DNA result submitted through a genealogical DNA system. At the word DNA, Caroline paused for a beat, then invited them in. Not because her guard dropped, but because she sensed this might be the next step in answering the mountain of doubts that had piled up since Helen's death. In the small living room, Carter explained the real reason for their visit. Caroline's DNA showed a high-level match with a decades-old unsolved case from New Jersey in 1954, and they needed to confirm it with a direct DNA test while collecting any items that might help with comparison. Caroline sat silently throughout the explanation, but her hands were clasped tightly together, as if letting go would make the vague memories slip away. When Carter asked whether she had ever found any childhood items whose origin she didn't know, she stood up, went to the bedroom, and brought out the wooden box, the object whose opening had completely changed her life. Briggs gently asked if they could look inside, and Caroline nodded. The items were laid out on the table: a 1950s child's dress, a bracelet engraved VP, and a stack of photos showing two women and a little girl. Briggs immediately recognized key details. The initials on the bracelet matched the Powell surname. The dress style fit the era when Victoria disappeared. And the little girl in the pictures bore a striking resemblance to an adult Caroline. The child in the photos appeared to be about 3 years old, the exact age Victoria Powell was when she vanished. Carter asked if Caroline recognized the women in the pictures. She said she only knew Helen, but the other woman felt strangely familiar, even though she had no memory of her. Briggs took notes on everything and asked permission to take the items to the lab for surface DNA analysis. A long-shot process after so much time, but still potentially useful if DNA had been preserved on the metal bracelet or on any hair caught in the dress lining. The most critical step, however, was collecting a direct DNA sample from Caroline. Briggs explained the procedure clearly: swabbed the inside of her cheek with a cotton swab, sealed it in a bar-coded evidence bag, and placed it in a special transport box for the federal lab. Throughout the process, Caroline said very little. She simply watched every movement, as if observing something beyond her comprehension, partly from anxiety, partly from the feeling that everything was moving toward a point of no return. After the sample was taken, Carter sat back down with Caroline to ask more about her childhood, what she remembered, and what she had never been sure of. Caroline described hazy memories: a white fence, a brightly colored garden, a woman's laughter that wasn't Helen's, a warm male voice she only caught glimpses of. Those descriptions lined up eerily with the original Powell family file, even though Caroline had never heard that name before. Briggs looked at Carter, and with just a glance, they both knew the direct DNA test would almost certainly confirm what they were thinking. 3 days later, the federal lab sent the results to the Newark office. Carter printed the analysis, laid it on the desk, and Briggs read every line, her eyes stopping at the final conclusion. DNA matched 99.98%, with data belonging to the Powell family, consistent with parent-child relationship. There was no longer any doubt: Caroline Hargrove was Victoria Powell, the 3-year-old who disappeared in 1954. Carter immediately called Briggs, and together they reviewed every piece of evidence again: the VP bracelet, the childhood photos, the facial match analysis, the timing of Caroline's appearance with Helen, the genealogical DNA data, and now the direct comparison result. Everything fit together into a complete picture that no one had managed to see for decades. When they returned to Pennsylvania to deliver the news, Caroline greeted them with eyes that mixed anxiety and hope for a real answer. Briggs opened the file, placed the DNA conclusion on the table, and explained that the results confirmed a direct blood relationship with the Powell family. Caroline was silent for a long time, her hand trembling slightly as she touched the papers. She didn't need anyone to say more. She understood that her life, the life that had always felt like it was missing half, finally had an explanation. She was not the Caroline Hargrove that Helen had raised. She was Victoria Powell, the child who vanished from New Jersey nearly 6 decades earlier. After the DNA results confirmed that Caroline was Victoria Powell, reconstructing exactly what happened in 1954 became essential to figure out what occurred on the day she disappeared, and how Helen Hargrove could have taken a 3-year-old from New Brunswick without leaving a trace. Agents Carter and Briggs began by tracking down any witnesses still alive from that time, even though nearly 60 years had passed. They located the list of former residents around Somerset Street and discovered that Detective Franklin Russo, the officer who worked the disappearance from the very first days, was still alive in the Edison suburbs, over 80 years old, but mentally sharp. Carter and Briggs scheduled a visit to his home, bringing the digitized case file and several photos from the wooden box Caroline had provided. When they arrived, Russo opened the door slowly, but his eyes lit up the moment he heard the name Victoria Powell, a name he thought had vanished into historical archives rather than real life. Carter explained they were re-examining the case from a new angle and needed his help to confirm details about witnesses and possible suspects from back then. Russo invited them into his living room, where the walls were covered with old 1950s police photos, sat down in his worn armchair, and told them to start from the beginning. Briggs opened the file and reviewed the key timeline points. Victoria Powell disappeared on a summer afternoon. Neighbors saw a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, and another witness described a dark green Ford near where the little girl was last seen. Russo nodded slowly, saying his memory still clearly retained the image of the woman in the wide hat, because it was the only identifiable detail in an otherwise information-poor case. He recalled that several residents described her as a stranger, average height, neatly dressed, wearing an old-fashioned wide-brimmed hat, walking slowly but seeming to study the area carefully. Russo said he had followed the direction she was last seen heading, but found nothing more. She simply melted away on the streets, an odd thing in a quiet residential neighborhood like Somerset back then. When Briggs showed him a photo of a young Helen, the picture found in the wooden box, Russo squinted at it for a long time, then said he never met Helen in person back then. But the woman in the photo matched the description: the hair, the nose, and especially the slightly hunched shoulder posture that witnesses had described as walking like she was trying not to be noticed. Carter pressed about the dark green Ford, the detail the FBI believed could be directly tied to Victoria being taken. Russo sighed and explained that dark green Fords were extremely common in the 1950s, which was exactly why the original investigation couldn't narrow suspects. Still, he clearly remembered one point. A witness had said the green Ford was driving slower than normal in the area, as if the driver was looking for something or confirming a location. When Carter showed Russo a photo of the old Ford Helen owned in later years, Russo tilted his head and said, if that was the car Helen used for many years, it was highly likely she owned it earlier too, making the match even stronger. Briggs shifted to the question of movement on the day of the disappearance, asking Russo whether it was possible for a suspect to leave New Brunswick within the first few minutes. Russo confirmed it was entirely possible. The small roads connecting Somerset to the main highways back then had no regular police patrols, and if the woman had planned it, she could have driven out of the neighborhood and reached the interstate network of New Jersey in under 10 minutes. He also recalled that many people believed the suspect must have lived nearby, but Russo never agreed with that theory because there was no sign the woman in the wide hat was familiar to anyone on the street. What especially caught Carter and Briggs's attention was Russo recounting an evening a few weeks after the disappearance, when a resident reported seeing a woman matching the description driving alone westward, the direct route to Pennsylvania. That report had been filed but, lacking further evidence, was classified as unverified. When Carter revealed that Caroline had grown up in Pennsylvania, Russo went quiet for several seconds, then said it fit in a chilling way with what he had long suspected but could never prove. Briggs asked about any other female suspects from the time. Russo remembered a few women who had been looked at because they had lost children or showed psychological instability, but none matched the physical appearance and behavior of the woman in the wide hat as closely. When he looked at Helen's photo again, Russo said her expression, wary and tense, reminded him of the original witness statements that the suspect appeared to be scanning the neighborhood with clear intent rather than just passing through. The conversation lasted over an hour, and when it ended, Russo gently squeezed Briggs's hand and said he never thought that case would be reopened, and certainly never imagined he would live to see proof that the little girl from back then was still alive. Carter and Briggs left Russo's house with crucial pieces. The description of the woman in the wide hat matched Helen, the car characteristics lined up, the travel direction was almost exact, and an old detective's memory had helped them connect the scattered dots of 1954 into a shape clearer than ever before. After the meeting with the old detective Franklin Russo, Carter and Briggs returned to the Newark office, with several critical pieces of the puzzle, but to complete the full picture, they needed to dig deeper into the private life of Helen Hargrove. The woman who had raised Caroline for decades yet was now the central figure in the suspicions surrounding the 1954 disappearance. They began by requesting copies of her residency records, medical files, and any administrative paperwork related to Helen during her years living in Pennsylvania. The first reports from the analysis team immediately caught their attention. In the Harrisburg Hospital records from 1953, Helen Hargrove's name appeared in connection with a premature birth that ended in the infant's death just hours later. The child was a girl, unnamed, recorded only by date and gender. The file noted that Helen left the hospital in a state described as emotionally unstable, exhibiting severe shock, and was strongly recommended for long-term psychological follow-up, but she never returned for treatment. This document provided the first real clue to a possible motive linking Helen to the Victoria Powell case, a devastating loss of her own child barely 1 year earlier. Briggs read the doctor's notes carefully and explained that mothers who lose a baby in the postpartum period are at high risk of complex psychological disorders, including anxiety, obsession, cognitive distortion, or an intense drive to replace the loss by caring for another child. In the 1953 treatment record, the physician described Helen clinging desperately to the baby's blanket, refusing to let nurses touch it, and repeatedly insisting, "She's still here." That note sent a chill down Carter's spine because it perfectly mirrored Helen's later extreme controlling behavior toward Caroline. Continuing the investigation, Briggs pointed out that Helen's move from Harrisburg to Lewisburg, late 1953, coincided with a period when she withdrew almost completely from social contact. This was corroborated by residency records. Helen rented a small house, paid quarterly in cash, never registered for any community activities, and was described as completely isolated. Carter and Briggs revisited the neighbor Fincher's statement, people who said Helen arrived alone in 1953 and showed no signs of having recently given birth. They concluded that Helen had deliberately hidden the loss of her child from everyone around her, maintaining an outward appearance of stability rather than acknowledging the massive trauma she was enduring. From this data, they began tracing Helen's movements during 1954, the year Victoria vanished. Pennsylvania Department of Motor Vehicles records showed Helen had a valid driver's license and purchased a dark green Ford in early 1954, matching the description of the car witnesses saw near the abduction site. To confirm Helen was actually in New Brunswick on the day of the incident, Carter requested checks of store receipts, gas station records, and any minor documentation along the route connecting Pennsylvania to New Jersey. One significant hit came from the archived receipts of a small family-owned gas station near Easton, directly on the route from Lewisburg to New Brunswick. The day before Victoria disappeared, a fuel purchase was recorded under the name Helen Hargrove. Recording customer names wasn't common practice at the time, but this station kept a log of unfamiliar patrons in case of short payment or later verification. Though only a small detail, it became powerful evidence that Helen had left Pennsylvania and was traveling toward New Jersey at the exact same time as the disappearance. Not stopping there, Carter and Briggs pulled the original New Brunswick police reports from the days immediately before and after the incident. One logged call reported a strange woman standing at the playground, watching the children during the week prior to the abduction. No name, minimal description, but Briggs noted the detailed wide-brimmed hat and carrying a small bag matched uncannily with the witness description Russo had mentioned. This overlap further solidified the theory that Helen had spent time surveilling the area before acting. Helen's presence in New Brunswick during that window painted a new picture. If she was struggling with the grief of losing her own baby, obsessed with caring for a child, and displaying psychological symptoms that could lead to distorted actions, it was entirely plausible she was driven by an unstable mental state to approach another child. Victoria. When Carter examined the few remaining administrative records for Helen in later years, they discovered she never filed any legal adoption paperwork, never reported having a child, and never appeared in the medical system with a young Caroline. This was a clear indication she deliberately avoided creating any paper trail tied to raising a child. Something that would only make sense if she knew Caroline's legal appearance would expose something irregular. Carter and Briggs compiled every piece of evidence: the dark green Ford purchase contract, the gas receipt, witness descriptions, physical appearance matches, post-loss psychological state, social withdrawal, and the DNA match with Caroline. Every sign pointed to Helen as the critical link in the Victoria Powell case. There was no evidence Helen ever physically harmed Caroline, but the motive of obtaining a child after losing her own, combined with decades of extreme control and concealment of Caroline's identity, painted a psychologically compelling portrait. As Briggs closed the file, she said something Carter silently agreed with: "If what we're seeing is accurate, then what happened in 1954 wasn't just a crime of impulse, it was the outcome of a year submerged in trauma, isolation, and desperation." After gathering all the pieces from Detective Franklin Russo's account, Helen Hargrove's psychological records, and the new evidence uncovered during the investigation, Carter and Briggs spent weeks reconstructing the 1954 abduction scene as accurately as possible, a task requiring extreme care since all data was old, maps had changed, witnesses were elderly or deceased, and the Somerset neighborhood no longer resembled its appearance 6 decades earlier. They started by cross-referencing every original statement with period maps of New Brunswick obtained from the city's historical library, the location of the playground where Victoria played most afternoons, the narrow streets connecting the residential area to main roads, and the spots where witnesses saw the woman in the wide-brimmed hat. On the old maps, the area was simple: a few rows of low houses, the playground in the center of the block surrounded by a well-maintained white picket fence, and only 2 exits wide enough for a car. This allowed Carter and Briggs to narrow down the suspects' likely escape routes. Based on Russo's recollection, Helen had appeared at the playground multiple times the week before the abduction, matching the description of a strange woman from outside the neighborhood, silently watching the children. Carter marked every sighting on the map in chronological order, first near the eastern entrance, then by the southern fence where children gathered, and finally on the side street leading to Somerset. When reconstructing the movements were plotted, they formed a clear, continuous path, showing Helen had scouted the area at least 2 or 3 times before acting, not an impulsive act, but preparation. Next, Briggs reviewed the Powells' original statements. Victoria had been playing near the southern fence, only a few yards from her mother, but out of sight for a few minutes, when Marilyn stepped inside to grab a sweater. Russo had emphasized the window between Victoria disappearing from view and the family realizing she was gone was only 2 to 3 minutes, too short for a team, but exactly enough for a lone individual with a vehicle already in place. This supported the theory that Helen acted alone. Going deeper, Carter used modern reconstruction software based on witness descriptions and the actual timeline. Helen, having observed the playground the previous week, returned on the exact afternoon Victoria was there, positioned herself a short distance away, and waited for the moment adult attention lapsed. From the witness vantage point, she could reach the southern fence in seconds, lean over, pick up 3-year-old Victoria, who would have been easily drawn to an adult, and walk quickly back to the dark green Ford parked nearby. Witnesses described the car driving away, not fast, indicating Helen deliberately avoided drawing attention. Briggs even used 1954 traffic patterns to determine the fastest quiet exit from Somerset without encountering routine patrols. Helen needed only to take one of 2 main turns onto the larger road, then head west toward Easton, where her gas receipt was recorded the previous day. Every piece fit together with surprising logic: surveillant returned, approach, remover, departure, all within 5 to 7 minutes. Carter realized what had caused the original investigation to stall wasn't police failure, but Helen's near-perfect timing, midday in summer when everyone assumed the neighborhood was safe. Lots of children playing, but adults distracted. No cameras or surveillance of any kind, and a dark green Ford so common it was impossible to trace. Briggs compared the old maps to current photos and noticed the playground fence in 1954 had a sparse section where an adult could easily reach through or lift a child over in seconds. That matched one witness's original statement, "I thought she bent down to pick something up, then walked away very fast." If what the witness saw wasn't picking up an object, but lifting Victoria, the entire event lasted only seconds, too brief for the family to react. The final question Carter and Briggs needed to answer was whether Helen had any accomplice. Every trace indicated she acted alone. No reports of two people in the car, no witness describing a second individual, and Helen's later reclusive, isolated lifestyle suggested she had accomplice nor shared her secret with anyone. When all the timelines, routes, and behaviors were aligned, Briggs concluded the abduction sequence was crystal clear. Helen, deeply psychologically damaged after losing her baby, watched the playground for days, identified the optimal moment, returned the day Victoria was present, waited for the family's brief lapse in attention, took Victoria through the sparse fence section, placed her in the Ford, and drove straight back to Pennsylvania. Carter wrote the final conclusion in the report: acted alone, pre-planned, no confrontation. Rapid, discreet movement. Sequence consistent with all newly obtained data, with the scene reconstructed, and the exact sequence established, the picture of 1954, blurry for 6 decades, finally emerged clearly under modern investigative light. After completing the 1954 scene reconstruction and reaching a clear conclusion about Helen Hargrove's actions, Carter and Briggs moved to the final step before releasing the full reopened case file, locating any surviving members of the Powell family to deliver the DNA results and prepare for a possible reunion after nearly 6 decades. They began by contacting the New Jersey Office of Vital Statistics to identify any remaining individuals from the Powell bloodline. The initial list contained nearly 20 people with the surname, but once narrowed to Edward and Marilyn Powell's direct branch, Victoria's parents, things became clearer. Edward had died in 1997 of heart disease. Marilyn passed in 2004. They never had another child after Victoria disappeared, but Edward's older brother, Henry Powell, was still alive and living in Cape May, New Jersey. The remaining relatives were distant and not directly connected to the 1954 events. When Carter reviewed Henry's file, the man was 80 years old and had actively participated in the initial search for Victoria in 1954. Henry was the last person close enough to represent the Powell family. If a reunion happened, he would be the first to welcome Victoria, now Caroline, back. After verifying the information, Carter and Briggs decided to deliver the news in person rather than by phone or email, understanding the extraordinarily sensitive nature of the situation. This wasn't just a routine case update. It was telling someone that their long-missing niece was confirmed alive. News that could completely alter the remainder of a life spent carrying grief for almost 60 years. When they arrived in Cape May, they found Henry living in a small seaside house where he had retired years ago, spending most of his time fishing and gardening. Briggs introduced them as FBI agents from Newark. Henry looked surprised but remained calm. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, Carter opened the file and said they had information regarding the 1954 disappearance of Victoria Powell. At the mention of Victoria's name, Henry froze. His already fading eyes seemed to light up for a moment. He said slowly that no one had spoken to him about the case in many years, but he had never forgotten the day she vanished. When Briggs placed the DNA report in front of him and explained that a woman named Caroline Hargrove had been positively identified as Victoria with 99.98% certainty, Henry at first said nothing. He stared at the printed results, then looked up at the agents as if confirming he hadn't misheard. When Carter reaffirmed that Victoria was indeed alive, Henry covered his face with both hands, trying to hold back emotion, but ultimately breaking into tears. The tears, he said, he had held in for so long, he thought they would never fall for good news. He told them that in the family, Victoria's disappearance was a wound that never healed. Edward and Marilyn lived the rest of their lives clinging to the faint hope their daughter might still be somewhere in the world, but they never knew the truth. When Briggs asked if Henry wanted to meet Caroline, he nodded immediately, without hesitation. Despite his age, his voice trembled, but was firm, when he said he wanted to tell Victoria the family had never stopped loving or forgetting her. Carter explained that before arranging a reunion, they needed to prepare both Caroline and Henry psychologically, because the event would be life-altering and could cause significant emotional shock for both sides. Henry understood, yet repeated that he was ready for anything as long as he could see his niece once more. Briggs and Carter helped Henry organize the necessary information so he could grasp the full context. Caroline had been raised by Helen from a very young age, knew nothing of her past, and Helen, the only person who could have explained everything directly, had passed away. Henry listened quietly, then softly said he didn't blame Helen, even if he couldn't comprehend her actions. For him, the most important thing now wasn't digging into motives or blame from the past, but the fact Victoria was alive and seeking answers just as he was. As the meeting ended, Carter and Briggs planned the official reunion under safe conditions with psychological support present. They left Cape May with a feeling both heavy and warm. Heavy, because of the 57 years of pain the story carried, yet warm because after so long apart, the Powell family finally had a chance to reclaim a peace they thought lost forever. The reunion would not just be a family moment, it would be closure for a case that had heartbroken an entire community for over half a century. On the day of the reunion, Carter and Briggs chose a small conference room at the FBI's Newark headquarters, not overly formal to add pressure, but private and secure enough for a life-changing encounter. Caroline sat near the window, hands clasped tightly together, as if letting go would make everything in front of her slip away. Since learning she was Victoria Powell, she had been living in a mixture of excitement, confusion, and fear. Excited at the possibility of answers about her past. Confused because the new identity felt too vast and distant from everything she had ever known. And afraid of how her biological family would react to seeing the little girl, who vanished, suddenly returning as a complete stranger in adult form. On the other side of the room, Henry Powell was escorted in by Briggs, walking slowly but with eyes noticeably brighter than during their first visit. He held a cane in one hand, and in the other, the same faded photograph of 3-year-old Victoria he had carried for 57 years, the last remaining keepsake. When he saw Caroline, he stopped, standing motionless for several seconds, as though his mind needed time to merge the image of the 1954 toddler with the woman now sitting before him. Briggs gently introduced them. "Henry, this is Caroline, and this is Victoria." Caroline stood, took a few steps, then paused, unsure what to say. Henry broke the silence first. He held out the old photograph and said in a trembling but clear voice, "You still have those same eyes." Caroline looked at the picture, then at Henry, tears welling up before she could speak. She didn't remember his face, but her heart responded with an inexplicable familiarity, as if some buried memory instantly recognized the man standing there. Carter and Briggs stepped back to one corner of the room, giving space for the moment to unfold naturally, with all the emotion it deserved. Henry walked closer to Caroline, each step deliberate, then placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze never leaving her face, as if memorizing every feature anew. He said, "We looked for you for years, our whole lives." Caroline began to cry, not from pain, but from feeling, for the first time, that she truly belonged somewhere. She whispered, "I didn't know anything. I don't remember the family." Henry shook his head gently. "It doesn't matter, you're here, that's enough." When they sat down, Carter handed Henry the official DNA conclusion and copies of the reconstructed 1954 files. Henry examined each page with absolute care, his hands shaking slightly, but his eyes steady. Finally he nodded, a long heavy nod, accepting the findings not only because of the DNA, but because every piece fit together in a way that could not be denied. Caroline stared at the documents, feeling as though she were reading about someone else's life, a missing child, a failed search, a family carrying pain for over half a century. She couldn't stop thinking about Edward and Marilyn, her birth parents, and the fact they had died, never knowing their daughter was alive. The realization tightened her chest with a regret that arrived too late, yet was no less profound. Henry told her that for years Marilyn continued placing flowers on the porch every year on Victoria's birthday, and Edward would stand in the backyard every evening, staring at the exact spot by the fence where she used to play. He said it not to sadden her, but so she would know she had always been loved, even when the family had lost all hope of finding her. Caroline listened to every word, tears falling steadily, this time not from fear or confusion, but from finally feeling a love she had never received since the day Helen took her away. The emotion overwhelmed her. She couldn't form complete sentences, but Henry understood, placed his hand over hers and said, "You don't have to be sorry. You didn't know. None of this is your fault." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, during which Henry shared fragments of memories about little Victoria, how she loved running across the grass, how she laughed whenever she saw the neighbor's cat, how she always grabbed her father's collar whenever he picked her up. Caroline had no recollection of those moments, yet she felt a deep connection, as if his stories were filling in pieces of memory she had never been able to hold onto herself. Carter and Briggs watched quietly, knowing this was the pivotal moment of the entire case, a missing child case with an ending almost none of its kind ever received. When the meeting ended, Henry stood slowly, took both of Caroline's hands, and told her he wanted to see her many more times, to introduce her to the remaining relatives, to take her to the places the family once lived, and if she wished, to tell her everything about her birth parents. Caroline nodded, speechless, but her eyes said everything: acceptance, gratitude, and a relief she had never known. As Carter opened the door for Henry to leave, the old man turned back for one last look, as if etching the image of his grown niece into his mind forever. He said, "It's been 57 years, and today is the first day we have Victoria again." The reunion did not end with applause or loud celebration, but with the beautiful silence of two people who found each other after nearly 6 decades apart. A moment, both warm and bittersweet, yet above all, complete, the emotional heart of the entire story. In the days following the reunion, Victoria, a name she was gradually learning to accept and pronounce as if it were a piece of memory coming back to life, began entering a complex phase of mental adjustment. After 57 years, living as Caroline Hargrove, she had to learn how to reconcile two versions of herself, a woman who had grown up in quiet solitude, and a 3-year-old child who had once been torn away from her birth family. The FBI arranged for her to meet with a psychologist to help process the pent-up emotions, but most of the time Victoria just wanted to sit in silence, reviewing the chain of events that had happened to her as though she had stumbled upon the final reel of a film at the very end of her life. Henry visited her often, bringing old photographs and telling her about their parents, Edward and Marilyn, in the years after she disappeared. He told her that Edward never let go of the little watch she used to play with, that Marilyn kept every small belonging of hers and never rearranged Victoria's room. Hearing those details, Victoria felt both pain and warmth, because they made her realize that despite the distance, the bond between them had never been broken. A few weeks later, Henry took her to the family cemetery in New Brunswick. That morning, the sun was gentle. A cool breeze blew in from the river, and the meadow surrounding the graves was still meticulously tended. Standing in front of the headstones bearing her biological parents' names, Victoria couldn't hold back her tears. She placed her hand on the cold stone, feeling as though she were touching a 60-year void she had missed. Henry stood beside her, saying nothing, just letting her remain silent for a long time. After a while, Victoria whispered, "I'm home now." Her voice was soft and trembling, but in that tone there was a certainty she had never known in her entire life. Afterward, the two of them sat under a row of nearby trees. Henry told her about the years following the abduction, how police had searched every corner of the neighborhood, how Edward traveled through multiple states looking for his daughter, how Marilyn nearly collapsed, yet never lost faith that Victoria was still alive. Those stories helped Victoria realize that the part of her life she had thought was empty had actually been filled with other people's love and longing. She simply hadn't been there to feel it. When they returned home, Henry gave her another wooden box, the Powell family box, containing a few small items that had once belonged to Victoria. A hair clip, a crayon scribble, and a birthday card Edward and Marilyn had written but never had the chance to give her. She held each object in silence for a long time. For Henry, watching his granddaughter touch those keepsakes felt like a circle finally closing. For Victoria, it was the moment she understood that memory doesn't live only in the mind, it also lives in the things preserved by other people's love. In the weeks that followed, Victoria began meeting distant relatives from the Powell line. At first she was anxious, afraid of curious or pitying stares, but what she received was genuine acceptance. Everyone understood she was not at fault, and everyone felt the profound emotion of a story once thought confined to archives suddenly having such a vivid ending. Henry drove her around town, showing her the old family home where their parents had lived, the playground where she vanished, and the street where it all began. Everything had changed. The house had been repainted, a different color. A new fence replaced the old white one, the playground was larger and more modern. Yet when she watched children running and playing, something deep inside her stirred. She had no clear memories, but the feeling of the place, the wind, the smell of grass, the lively sounds, told her that some part of her subconscious still held on to those brief early days. During this time, Victoria and Henry also attended several counseling sessions arranged by the FBI. The therapist helped them understand that reuniting after decades was not only joy, but also psychological shock, because both sides had to learn to fill the time gap with something other than memories. For Henry, it was relief, after a lifetime of waiting. For Victoria, it was accepting that her life had two completely separate chapters, one stolen and one returned. Still, integration was not easy. The media began taking interest, and Victoria had to learn to face public attention while still grappling with her new identity. Henry advised her to take small steps, meet family, revisit places tied to memories, and most importantly, allow herself to feel, rather than try to understand everything at once. She followed his advice, gradually participating more in family gatherings, helping Henry organize their parents' old documents, and eventually agreeing to move closer to him in Cape May. Every afternoon they went to the beach. Henry fished while she simply sat watching the water. One day Henry said, "You know, the real miracle isn't that we found each other. It's that you lived well, even though no one knew who you were." Victoria smiled, the wind blowing through her hair, the sunset reflected in eyes that had once lost everything and now had found themselves again. Her new life arrived quietly, without drama, gentle like the ocean waves, slow, patient, and day by day, carrying her back to the world that had always been hers. News of Victoria Powell's true identity being confirmed spread rapidly within days of the reunion. At first, it was only a short local segment on a Newark station, but once editors realized this was the longest-running missing person case in New Jersey history. Solved through modern DNA technology, the story instantly became national news. Major outlets, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN, ran headlines. 57-year cold case cracked by DNA. Little girl missing since 1954, found alive. The event quickly moved beyond criminal investigation and became a social phenomenon, with people across the country discussing the power of technology, the family's unextinguished hope, and the possibility that even seemingly hopeless disappearances could still have endings. The FBI's Newark office held an official press conference in which Special Agents Carter and Briggs were introduced as the leads on the reinvestigation. They presented the full timeline from the initial genealogical DNA hit, verification process, recovery of old files, reconstruction of the 1954 scene, all the way to the reunion between Victoria and Henry. Although many personal details were withheld to protect Victoria's privacy, the room grew emotional when Briggs said that watching Victoria and Henry embrace was a moment that made every year of investigation worth it. After the press conference, countless news programs, podcasts, and documentaries began producing specials on the case. Old photographs of 3-year-old Victoria, images of the silver bracelet engraved VP, maps of the scene, and faded notes from Detective Franklin Russo appeared on screens, recreating the atmosphere of 1950s New Jersey. Criminology experts called it not only a triumph of forensic science, but a prime example of the human value in cold case work, where the ultimate goal is not to prosecute but to restore identity to the forgotten. The public was especially fascinated by Victoria's journey. How a middle-aged woman who had lived almost 6 decades under another name discovered she was the child who vanished without a trace. Many articles called her the woman who returned from the past, and some TV segments compared the case to other famous ones, though none had lasted this long with the victim still alive to tell the tale. Media also explored the psychological aspect of Helen Hargrove, the woman who took Victoria. Neurologists and psychologists were invited to discuss grief-induced trauma and replacement child behavior. Though some criticized Helen, most of the public viewed her with sympathy rather than condemnation. A grieving, lonely woman haunted by the need to mother a child, inadvertently turning it into an irredeemable crime. Victoria's story, therefore, was not confined to legal boundaries, but became a symbol of lives broken by tragedy and how people can mend them even when it seems too late. In the weeks after the news broke, hundreds of letters and emails poured into the FBI's Newark office and the Powell family mailbox. Some expressed admiration, others said they had lost loved ones and now felt hope, and some offered donations to create a fund for identifying long-term missing persons. Several TV stations asked Victoria for interviews, but she declined nearly all, agreeing only to one short piece for the local New Brunswick paper, where everything began. In it, she said, she didn't want to be called a miracle, because nothing happened by miracle, it happened because someone never stopped looking for me. That quote spread widely, appearing on social media, evening news, and became the most repeated line about the case. Older residents of New Jersey, who had been witnesses or heard their parents recount the 1954 disappearance, said, knowing the little girl was still alive, felt like a piece of community memory had been healed. At the government level, the governor sent congratulations to the FBI and New Brunswick police for maintaining complete records, allowing resolution after more than half a century. A small ceremony was held in Newark, where Carter and Briggs received commendations for exceptional cold case work, but both humbly said, all credit goes to DNA technology and human perseverance. To the public, the Victoria Powell case was not just a solved crime, it was proof that time, no matter how long, cannot completely erase truth. In the final news segments, the image of Victoria and Henry, sitting together outside the seaside house in Cape May, was shown again, 2 people from different generations connected by a past once thought irretrievable. And even as the media spotlight faded, the story continued to be remembered as one of the most moving milestones in New Jersey legal history. Once the public frenzy died down and life slowly returned to normal, Victoria began the most difficult yet necessary phase of her journey back to herself, legally restoring her true identity and rebuilding her life on a new foundation for the first time without relying on someone else's secret. With support from the FBI and New Jersey state agencies, she started the process of legally becoming Victoria Powell again, replacing every document that had carried the name Caroline Hargrove. It was a complicated procedure that lasted months, because every previous record, ID, driver's license, Social Security, medical files, had been issued under the old name. Carter helped her coordinate with the Department of Justice to certify the DNA results, while Henry provided the original birth certificate, family records, and 1954 missing person files, and other evidence. Each time she signed a form Victoria Powell, she paused for a few seconds, as if absorbing the weight of letters that had belonged to her all along, but were only now allowed to exist again. When the new ID card was handed to her, and the clerk offered the usual perfunctory congratulations, To Victoria it was profoundly meaningful. That small piece of paper was not just legal documentation, it was certification that a person once erased from the records of life had returned. She began using her real name on everything and grew accustomed to hearing others say, Victoria, without flinching. At first, it still felt foreign, like someone else's name, but gradually it became familiar, as if her body had always known it and only forgotten for too long. After the legal formalities were complete, Victoria delved deeper into Powell family history, something she had previously known only through Henry's stories. She spent hours in the New Brunswick Library reading old news clippings, 1954 articles, and police notebooks. Every scrap of information was a thin thread connecting her to the past, and even the painful parts, especially the description of the day she disappeared, she wanted to read in full. Henry helped her reconstruct the family tree, pointing out distant relatives still alive in various states. Some knew the case, others only as distant legend, but when Henry called to say Victoria had been found, everyone was stunned. Letters, emails, and phone calls arrived steadily. Many wrote that they had prayed for her without ever meeting her. Some said their mothers had kept Victoria's photo throughout childhood as a cautionary reminder. Reading those words, Victoria felt both small and uplifted by the affection of strangers. They welcomed her, not just as someone returning, but as a piece of collective memory made whole again. From there, she began meeting relatives in small groups. The first gathering was at Henry's house in Cape May, where the blue ocean stretched to the horizon and the porch carried the familiar smell of salt air. Relatives came from all over. Some brought old photos, some family albums, some simply to see the real Victoria. Every hug and greeting carried indescribable emotion. One great-aunt said she had held baby Victoria and remembered the lightly curly hair and bright eyes, then cried seeing the same gaze in the woman before her. The gathering lasted until evening, filled with laughter mixed with tears. Henry sat quietly watching everyone surround his granddaughter. His face relaxed in a rare peace after decades of carrying the weight of waiting. Victoria started taking new photographs and recording people's stories, as if gathering all the fragments of memory others held about her to complete the missing picture of her own life. She also revisited places tied to family history, the old house in Trenton, where her grandfather lived, the little church where her parents were married, and the former dock where Edward worked before retiring early from grief. At each spot she took a photo, not to preserve the past, but to mark that she was truly present now. When she wasn't traveling, she kept a journal. A new habit formed after everything came to light. In it she wrote daily feelings, dreams of a childhood never lived, and what it felt like when someone called her by her real name. Every time I hear Victoria, it's as if someone is waking me from a half-century sleep, she wrote on one page. The integration process continues, but now every step has clear meaning. She is no longer searching for answers, she is living inside the answer itself. When Carter and Briggs visited one last time to close the file, they found her calmer, more open, and already planning for the future. She told them she wants to work on projects that help identify long-term missing persons, because no one should have to live without knowing who they are. Briggs smiled and said that statement alone was the perfect way to close the entire case. Not with sirens or a court verdict, but with one woman's journey to find herself again after 57 years lost in someone else's name. Although the Victoria Powell case was officially closed with a clear conclusion regarding the victim's identity and the circumstances of the abduction, many questions still hang unanswered. Questions that even Carter and Briggs, the detectives who directly reinvestigated the case, could never fully resolve. Every time they reviewed the file, they were reminded that certain gaps would never be filled, certain details that only one person could have confirmed, Helen Hargrove, and she was no longer alive to speak. The first and biggest question has always revolved around why Helen chose Victoria out of all the other children in New Brunswick at that time. Psychological data shows Helen fell into a state of severe disturbance after losing her own child, becoming obsessed with repairing the loss by caring for another child. But why Victoria, the 3-year-old girl who lived in a neighborhood Helen had no direct connection to? Carter once theorized that Helen might have passed through the area multiple times while shopping or visiting acquaintances, happened to see Victoria, and instantly formed an attachment. Briggs believed Helen may have known the Powell family through some indirect channel, perhaps the hospital, a store, or an old acquaintance, but there was no hard evidence. Even though the psychological motive was clearly established, the way Helen stalked and approached her target remains astonishing. There is no evidence she was ever noticed during the surveillance period, despite it being a small neighborhood where everyone knew each other's faces. Rousseau once said the woman in the wide-brimmed hat appeared quietly, never drawing attention, and no one thought she had any purpose other than strolling around. This leads to the second question: did Helen have an accomplice? When Carter and Briggs combed through every record, they found no trace of anyone who had been closely connected to Helen in 1954. Residence and bank records all showed she lived alone. No relatives, no close friends, no intimate co-workers. Yet a few small details still nagged at Briggs: an old witness statement claiming the green Ford had 2 people in it when it left the neighborhood, or at least a second silhouette in the front seat. However, the witness had been far away, the light was poor, and no one could confirm it. The 1954 police investigation found no physical trace of a second person in the car, and any such evidence had long since vanished over the decades. Carter believed that if an accomplice existed, they probably only helped with transportation or cover, without direct involvement in the abduction. But when Helen died, no one ever came forward or left a confession, so the theory remains only a possibility. The third question is how long Helen had been planning. Looking back at the evidence, Carter is convinced she did not act on impulse. Buying the Ford, traveling from Pennsylvania to New Jersey, observing the playground multiple times, choosing the exact moment, and returning on the very day Victoria disappeared, all point to a carefully prepared sequence of events. A person in the midst of psychological breakdown, yet still lucid enough to plan. That is the part that defies easy explanation. Briggs once described Helen as someone who was both out of control and overly calculating. She was rational enough to avoid detection, yet desperate enough to believe taking a child could heal her own pain. The preparation period may have lasted weeks, possibly months, from the moment she first saw Victoria until the day she acted. But every direct piece of evidence from that phase has disappeared with time. No diary, no letters, no witness with a clear memory. Only indirect clues, gas receipts, witness descriptions, and matching travel routes allowed investigators to partially reconstruct her plan. The final question, and the saddest note in the entire file, is that the case was officially closed because the sole suspect was dead. Helen Hargrove passed away in 2010, almost exactly when Caroline began to suspect her own identity. Had she lived just a few more years, a confrontation between Helen and Victoria might have taken place, and perhaps all of the above questions would have received answers. But reality did not allow it. When Carter signed the final investigation report, the last line simply read, "Case closed due to death of the only suspect. Prosecution no longer possible." Nevertheless, the case was recorded as resolved, because the core objectives, establishing identity, and the circumstances of the disappearance had been achieved. For the justice system, the matter was finished. But for those directly involved, especially Victoria, Helen remains an enigma that was never deciphered. Did Helen ever feel remorse? Did she truly believe she was doing the right thing by taking Victoria? Or was she only trying to fill her own emptiness? No one knows. Every clue ended the moment Helen took her last breath, leaving a patch of darkness between the two bright parts of the story. The part before was guilt. The part after was redemption. Carter once said in an internal meeting that this case is closed, but not truly over, because some things cannot be measured with evidence. They can only be felt through intuition and compassion. And perhaps, in Helen's eternal silence, those questions will forever remain unanswered. After the case was officially closed, and the unanswerable questions about Helen gradually settled, it seemed Victoria Powell's life would finally consist only of peaceful days with her biological family. But then something no one expected began to happen. Childhood memories she thought had vanished completely started returning, slowly in fragments, yet clearer with each passing day. At first, they were only fleeting images: the smell of hot apple pie rising from the kitchen, the ticking of a wall clock, the soft tap of someone's shoes on wooden floors. These memories did not arrive like dreams, they appeared as sudden recognitions in everyday life. One morning, while visiting the old Powell house with Henry, Victoria stood motionless on the doorstep for a long time. She whispered that she had once seen this doorway from a much lower angle when she was still a little child. She accurately described the location of the small table by the window and the white curtains with embroidered flowers along the bottom edge. Details that stunned Henry because the house had been renovated many times and only he still remembered those features. The feeling that memories were flowing out like water, finally finding an opening, both moved and frightened Victoria. She did not force herself to remember, she let everything come naturally, and the less she pushed, the more fragments appeared. On another occasion, when the radio played a classical piece from the 1950s, she suddenly froze. She knew that melody. It was the music Marilyn used to play every afternoon. She told Henry she remembered a soft voice humming along with it. When Henry played an old 1953 recording of Marilyn's voice, Victoria sat silently for hours, tears streaming uncontrollably. The voice of the mother she had never remembered had apparently lain buried deep in her subconscious. The moment the exact tone rang out, everything flooded back. Little by little, everyday details of the Powell household returned like puzzle pieces finding one another. Breakfast habit of toast with peanut butter, the lavender-scented soap her mother always used, the wicker chair where her father read the newspaper. Each returning memory brought intense emotion, not just because truth was being restored, but because she realized she had never truly lost those things. They had simply been covered over for decades by a different life. One evening in Cape May, while talking with Henry, Victoria suddenly described being carried on a man's shoulders, the metal of his watch gently tapping her arm each time he lifted her higher. Henry was quiet for a moment, then opened a drawer and took out Edward's old pocket watch, the one his son had always carried. When he snapped the cover open and the familiar ticking sounded, Victoria flinched, then burst into tears. That sound, I remember that sound. That was the moment Henry understood. Memories are never lost. They only sleep very deeply. After that night, more small memories kept returning. The backyard with its rows of tulips, the mailman's knock every morning, and the blinding sunlight through the curtains on the noon of the day she disappeared. She said that when that light came back to her, her body trembled, not from fear, but from the realization that this was the final moment of her childhood before being torn from her old world. Carter and Briggs, after hearing the stories from Henry, visited once more to add notes to the case appendix. They observed that Victoria's memory worked through emotional regression, not chronological events, but sensations and sensory details, colors, sounds, smells, which then triggered the scenes. The psychologist accompanying them explained that this is common in people who suffered childhood trauma. Once the truth is restored, the mind cautiously reopens old compartments in a protective way, allowing gradual acceptance rather than collapse. For Victoria, the process was not damaging. It was healing. She said that each time a memory returned, it felt like resuming an interrupted conversation with her parents, as if she could finally answer the questions they had once asked. But she never had the chance to answer. One afternoon, walking along Somerset Street, she stopped in front of the rebuilt playground and told Henry she remembered falling there once, scraping her knee, her mother rushing over while her father smiled and said, "Strong people don't cry." Henry confirmed it had happened. Edward had written about it in his diary. The perfect match brought tears to the old man's eyes. With each restored detail, Victoria was not only reclaiming her own past, but also making the Powell family feel that Edward and Marilyn were somehow still present, illuminated once more through memories brought back to life. That night she wrote in her journal, "Memories didn't come back noisily, as I had imagined. They arrived with a breeze, with the tick of a watch, with a voice long gone, and when I heard them, I knew I had truly come home." The following spring, once her childhood memories had largely returned, and her new life had stabilized, Victoria decided to do something she had long hesitated over: return to New Brunswick, the place where everything began, and where her childhood was severed. Henry accompanied her, despite his failing health, because he understood this trip was not just about looking back, it was the final step for Victoria to fully emerge from the shadow that had lasted nearly 6 decades. They left early in the morning. The road to the Somerset neighborhood was now busier, the houses modern and bustling, no longer the quiet appearance of 1954. When the car stopped at the familiar intersection, Victoria got out without a word, stood still, and looked around, trying to separate old from new. Though the scenery had changed, something in the air still felt familiar, perhaps the direction of the wind, the quality of light, or the rustle of leaves in the trees. They walked slowly down the street. Henry recounted how little Victoria used to run along the southern fence, now replaced by a brick wall. She stopped there, gently placed her hand on the cold surface, and pictured the white picket fence her mother used to repaint every summer. "I think this is the last place I ever saw my parents," she said softly. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held layers of emotion, no longer fear but understanding. At the playground, she lingered even longer. The old site had been turned into a small park with new play equipment, benches, and a fountain. Children were laughing in the sunshine. She stood watching a little girl run past, her ponytail bouncing in the breeze. The sight tightened her chest, both familiar and distant, like seeing her younger self in another time. Henry sat on a nearby bench, quietly giving her space. She walked slowly around the park and stopped in a shady corner, the spot where witnesses once saw the woman in the wide-brimmed hat. In her mind, she heard wind and leaves, and for a fleeting second, she saw the blurred image of a figure approaching, gentle yet firm arms lifting her away. There was no fear, only the sensation of losing balance, and then darkness. The vision lasted only seconds, but it was enough that she had to steady herself on a bench. Henry hurried over, worried, but she just smiled. "I'm okay," I remembered, and that's all I needed to remember. They continued along the road leading east, the route where the green Ford once vanished from witnesses' sight. The road was now wider, with traffic lights and rows of new shops, but the wind still blew the same way, and Victoria felt an odd peace as she watched cars pass. She said she had once imagined this scene would destroy her, but now it felt like release. "I was inside that car once," she told Henry. "But now I'm standing outside looking back. That means the memory no longer holds me prisoner." Her voice was firm and light. Afterward, they visited the old Powell house. The new owners, upon hearing the story, kindly let them inside. Victoria stepped into the entryway, looked at every corner, and said the smell of the wood was exactly as she remembered. She touched the stair banister, gazed at the window where sunlight used to pour in, then turned to Henry. "I thought those memories were gone forever. Turns out they were only waiting for me to come back." In the living room, Henry opened the suitcase he had brought, took out the 1953 family photograph, and placed it on the table. They sat side by side in silence for a long time. Henry whispered, "Now everything is back where it belongs." Victoria nodded. She understood. He didn't mean everything could be restored, but the truth had returned, along with the final piece of memory that had been stolen. When they left the house, she looked back once more. For an instant she thought she saw 2 figures standing on the porch, her father and mother, smiling gently as in the old photographs. She didn't try to decide whether it was imagination or something else. She simply let the image stay in her mind as a long overdue goodbye. On the drive home, Henry asked if she felt lighter. She answered that her heart had never been so at peace. I no longer have to guess what happened. I've seen it all, not with my eyes, but with memory. Henry squeezed her hand gently, his smile tired yet fulfilled. As the car left the Somerset neighborhood, Victoria gazed out the window at the late afternoon sunlight, spilling over the street where her story had once stopped. This time, she knew she was passing through not to flee the past, but to put a peaceful period at the end of it. A period without fear or loss, only release and gratitude for the chance to return to the place her life had once been stolen. After the trip back to New Brunswick, the journey that closed the past and released nearly 6 decades of buried pain, Victoria entered a new chapter of her life, one in which she was no longer haunted by the question, "Who am I?" but began learning how to live with the answer. Yet rebuilding her personal identity was not about erasing the past and replacing it with a new one. On the contrary, she had to find a way to reconcile the two halves of her life. Caroline Hargrove and Victoria Powell, 2 names, 2 lives, 2 parallel sets of memories coexisting inside the same person. In sessions with her psychologist, she admitted that sometimes even she didn't know how to refer to herself. Caroline is the one who grew up, worked, loved, and lost. Victoria is the child who was taken, forgotten. Yet now the name I have to carry, she said. The therapist advised her not to choose one side, but to see both as pieces of the same journey. So in her daily journal she began writing alternately. Today Caroline went to the market, but Victoria was the one admiring the flowers along the way. Gradually the boundary between the 2 names blurred, and she realized she no longer needed to separate them because both were real. Caroline had taught her how to survive. Victoria taught her how to feel. That combination helped her find a balance she had never known before. Alongside healing herself, Victoria also worked to rebuild relationships with her biological family, people she loved yet still felt an invisible distance from, because they belonged to a part of her life she had never lived. Henry acted as the bridge, organizing small gatherings where Victoria could slowly get to know relatives, listen to their family stories, and share her own memories in return. She discovered that, despite the differences, they welcomed her with genuine warmth. No one tried to take her back from Caroline, they only wanted her to be at peace. Every weekend she went to Cape May, walking the beach with Henry, while he told her about Edward and Marilyn, and the years they endured, their grief sustained by the belief their daughter was still alive. Henry said perhaps that very belief had kept Victoria alive in this world, like an invisible thread connecting both ends of time. She listened, smiled, and felt her heart grow lighter after each conversation. She also became more involved in the community, accepting invitations to speak at programs supporting missing persons, collaborating with organizations dedicated to identity recovery, and helping others searching for their origins. When telling her own story, she did not speak in the heavy tone of tragedy, but with the calm of someone who had made peace with it. "I don't want people to remember me as the girl who was kidnapped," she said at a panel discussion, "but as someone who found her real name again." Those words left the room silent for a long moment, followed by prolonged applause. At the same time she was reconnecting with the community, Victoria continued to care for her mental health. She kept regular therapy appointments, learned meditation and breathing exercises, and wrote in her journal. The nighttime panic attacks that once woke her in cold sweat gradually became less frequent. In their place came gentler dreams. She saw herself playing in a flower garden with Henry, heard Marilyn's laughter, and woke feeling loved. Every morning she brewed coffee, opened the windows to let in the sunlight, and played a piece of classical music, just as Marilyn used to do. Sometimes she even whispered, "Good morning, Mom," as a way of talking to the past. Henry noticed the clear change in her eyes no longer shadowed, her voice low but warm. "You're starting to look like Marilyn used to be," he teased, making Victoria smile. Beyond emotional recovery, she actively studied genetics and forensic investigation, not to become an expert, but to better understand the mechanism that had allowed her to be found. She said, the thing she was most grateful for was that technology could give a second chance to people believed gone forever. Whenever news broke that another cold case had been reopened, she followed it and sent quiet good wishes to the victims' families as her silent way of giving thanks. By the end of the summer, she moved permanently closer to Henry, renting a small house overlooking the ocean. In the evenings, the two of them often sat together on the porch in silence, watching the sun set. Henry said seeing her like that made him feel time had come full circle. Victoria had returned, not as a missing child, but as a woman who had been through everything and still stood strong. In the journal she kept that final year she wrote, "I once lived two lives once, but now there is only one. Caroline carried me through the darkness. Victoria led me back to the light. Now both live inside me, and I no longer have to choose." That entry marked the completion of her journey to rebuild her identity, not by erasing the past or denying memories, but by accepting everything as an inseparable part of herself. More than a year after Victoria Powell's true identity was restored, the case closed not only with personal meaning, but also left a profound impact on criminal investigation and on society's understanding of the value of justice, however delayed. Experts viewed it as the clearest proof yet of DNA's breakthrough role in solving cold cases, files once thought permanently dormant. Without modern genetic analysis technology and the nationwide genealogical DNA system, no one could have linked a middle-aged woman's DNA sample from Pennsylvania to the 1954 disappearance of a 3-year-old girl in New Jersey. Scientific progress not only provided precise identification tools, but also restored faith that old cases, however deeply buried by time, could still be illuminated by data. Following the case, FBI Newark announced plans to expand its cold case DNA database and urged families who had lost children or loved ones to submit samples for comparison. Within months, thousands of new samples arrived, and at least 4 other long-dormant missing persons cases were reopened. The media called it the Powell effect, a wave of voluntary public cooperation with law enforcement, not only to find missing relatives, but to reinforce the belief that preserving data is never pointless. What the Victoria Powell case left behind went beyond technology. It underscored the importance of preserving records, yellowed pages once considered worthless that later became keys for the next generation. Had the 1954 files not been kept intact, had reports, statements, maps, and even names like Franklin Rousseau been lost, the reinvestigation could never have found the connecting thread. As a result, many U.S. states began reviewing their cold case archives, gradually digitizing them and training new detectives in the value of historical data. A comma in today's file can be tomorrow's evidence, Carter said at a 2013 Bureau conference, a line quoted repeatedly in training programs. The case also made New Jersey communities rethink how they understood disappearance. For decades, Victoria Powell's name survived only in the memories of the elderly, as a sad story without an ending. But when she was found, that collective memory was revived and turned into hope for hundreds of other families still waiting. Nonprofit organizations for missing children used her story as the classic example of why searches should never be abandoned. In schools, it became a lesson in perseverance, science, and compassion. At the National Missing Children's Conference in Washington, Victoria's name was mentioned in the opening remarks as the symbol of the phrase, "never too late." From a human perspective, the case also highlighted the moral dimension of justice, that solving a case is not only about finding the perpetrator or closing the file, but about returning identity, memory, and truth to the victim. Victoria did not merely regain her name, she was given back her place in history, something seemingly simple yet the most vital thing for a person once erased from all records. Briggs once said, "We cannot change the past, but we can give back their place to those lost within it." That sentence was later engraved on a memorial plaque at FBI Newark headquarters, beneath the words Case 1954, closed after 57 years. As for Victoria herself, she did not want her story labeled a tragedy. Appearing on a television panel, she said, "I don't want people to remember me as a kidnapping victim, but as proof that justice can arrive, even late." Her voice was calm, her gaze steady, and the audience was deeply moved. For Henry and the Powell family, Victoria's return was not only a miracle, but a reminder that every effort, however small, has value if preserved properly. The case ended, yet its influence spread through the legal system, the media, and public consciousness. New Jersey missing children centers received additional staff, funding, and community DNA training programs. Old cases were re-examined, and families who had lost hope began contacting authorities again. In the year-end report, the final line, handwritten by Carter, read, "No disappearance is ever too old to be solved. As long as one person still remembers, one file is preserved, one DNA sample exists, there is still hope." That simple message was enough to conclude a 57-year journey, one that did not merely find one person, but proved that time, however cruel, cannot bury the truth forever. The story of Victoria Powell, the little girl kidnapped in 1954 and found after 57 years, is not only a solved case, it also reflects many profound aspects of modern American society. Faith in justice, the value of science, and the power of human memory. From that journey, we see clearly that technology, especially DNA, is not merely an investigative tool, but a bridge between past and present. In a society increasingly dependent on data like today's America, preserving information, records, and each individual's right to be recorded carries enormous human meaning. Had Victoria's file not been kept, had the DNA not been compared, she might have lived forever without knowing who she was. It is a reminder that every detail, however small, has value in investigation, as in life. Victoria's story also speaks of emotional resilience, of how human beings can rediscover themselves after losses once thought irreparable. Though her identity was stolen, she found a way to reconcile the two halves of her life, between Caroline and Victoria, just as every American today must learn to balance past and present, personal identity, and societal change. The lesson drawn from it is this: never believe it is too late to change, too late to find the truth, or to find yourself again. No matter how long the time, America and each of us can still begin anew if we hold on to patience, faith, and the desire to find light in the darkness. Thank you for joining us on the 57-year journey to restore Victoria Powell's identity, a story that proves the truth never disappears. It only waits to be found. Please subscribe to the channel to keep following cases solved through faith, memory, and the power of justice. See you in the next video.